Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. What if Naruto was a pervy trainer and had slept with Delia Ketchum? Movie. A labyrinth of diaphanous fog hung over the forest in the arcane light of the morning. Fetters of mist soon fastened themselves around the wood, leaving no tree unharmed. Like unholy incense, it wafted and spirited through the thickets, swathing everything in its vaporous patina. Then came a drizzle, but it wasn't the kind that washes everything anew, giving birth to puddles into which children splash. No, it fell in chaotic drops, the gusting wind carrying anything and everything in wild vortices one moment and in diagonal sheets the next. When the last shred of haze had disappeared, a flood river raced through the forest, as if to celebrate nature's verve and vigor. The sky was stirring itself into frenzy when a boom rolled across the valley, announcing the start of what the brooding nimbuses had promised since dawn. Then, thunder rumbled, casting the surroundings in premature twilight while a clangorous clap of fury like heaven's anvil bellowed through for miles. A gash of liquid light appeared from the breach above, after which came an electrostatic crackling, buzzing, cackling and fizzing with furious intensity. It was like Arceus was enraged with the state of the world. Meanwhile, a man was ignorant to the wild weather as he was sauntering down a dim-lit hallway. Every footfall echoed around, not loudly, but enough to give away his position to anyone in the vicinity. There was a gleam of deviltry in his eyes as he stepped out of the hallway and inside the room that was located at the end of the hall. His nostrils flared from inhaling the aroma of setting agar plates and what smelt to be an undertone of bleach. The brattle of sundry machines rang through his eardrums while he scanned the white-coated individuals shuffling around in choreographed murmurs as they drew pipettes of fluid from one tiny tube and transferred them to others. He nodded in approval, though his minions didn't have a choice other than perform to the best of their ability. After all, scientists were a dime a dozen in a land as technologically advanced as the Kanto region. But as much as his interest was piqued with the progress of the Black Pokeball project, forcing evolution on whatever Pokemon was captured inside the ball, it wasn't what he came here for. The scientists collectively sighed in relief as he strolled past them and began making his way to the edge of the lab. He was now standing in front of a concrete door, but there was no handle on it as it was controlled by an interface. A medium-sized GL panel was embedded in the wall, and through it he could see into the darkened room. It was then he caught a glimpse of a black-haired scientist, who was sitting in front of a machine that seemed to be sorting hundreds of test tubes, rotating them, counting them, labeling them, and finally delivering them into his hands. Reaching for the interface near the door, he pressed on it, activating the built-in microphone. "What's the verdict, Simon?" Master Giovanni," cried out Simon, a childhood friend and former colleague of Bill, who was one of the greatest engineers of all time. He was also phenomenal in his own right, as he had played a major role in the invention of the computer systems that are now in every Pokemon Center. He had also been commissioned by the Pokemon League on more than one occasion. Needless to say, there would be hysteria in Kanto if word got out that he was being employed by Team Rocket. "Speak," prodded the notorious criminal. "What have you learned?" Using a sample of DNA from Mew to create Mewtwo was the highlight of his career as a villain. Unfortunately, he discerned not too long afterward that subjugating the creature was easier said than done. Its psychic abilities were ungodly and it didn't help that it was extremely weary of his scientists. It took some finagling from his end, but soon the Pokemon consented to wear an armored suit his scientists had whipped up. Little did it know, doing so had only sealed its fate. Things started going phenomenally from that point on. Then, one day, the creature made a beeline for what appeared to be a comet streaking down the sky. It took well over 15 minutes for him to catch up on his chopper. When he got there, he saw it kneeling over a fallen figure which he identified as a charred blonde-haired male. It was mind-blowing to him that he wasn't dead because no one should be able to survive such a brutal fall. It matters not how you perceive it. This human is far stronger than I. In fact, there is no comparison. Mewtwo was many things, but fearful wasn't one of them. Not even while donning that armor did it ever feel threatened by him. However, it was shaking from just being in the presence of this man. Ever since then the blonde has been locked up in this laboratory. Mewtwo had put him in a psychic-induced coma so his scientists could experiment to their heart's content. Unfortunately, he couldn't stay for the preliminary tests because he had to meet with a few key figures to finish machinating their next move. "Why yes, Lord Giovanni," stammered Simon with a timorous nod. My attempts to operate on our test subject were futile, as every cut would regenerate within seconds of me putting down the surgical instrument. This intrigued me to no ends, and so I began testing his endurance to the elements. I put him through temperatures as hot as that on Mount Chimney, colder than that on Mount Silver, and just about everything under the sun. But his body was unconsciously able to acclimate to it all. That too with ease. The vents inside this section of the lab were controlled by a computer. It was created to test the capability of genetically modified Pokémon, and it's where his scientists experimented Mewtwo in. He was shocked to hear what the creature was able to stomach back then, but this human had endured even more than that. Intriguing, breathed out a stunned Giovanni. How is it possible? I don't know, sir, replied Simon in a faraway tone. I was enthralled, so I took a sample of his blood and used it to run a complete blood work. The readings told us that his organs are functioning at well beyond what is deemed possible for humans. His heart, for example, pumps more blood than 20 men do put together. He then raised his hand, having cited that his boss was about to interrupt. It wasn't his intention to die here, but he needed to get this out. What is most critical to note is that I also conducted 3 separate ultrasounds, including a musculoskeletal one. I'm still addled by these readings, but I will have a more definitive answer for you by tomorrow. What I can say for sure is that the power he holds is inconceivable. I've studied enough Pokémon and humans alike to distinguish aura. I've even had the distinct pleasure of getting a read on Mewtwo. However, the energy coursing through our friend here is so vast and potent that our machines couldn't analyze a fraction of it before malfunctioning. Team Rocket's leader exuded his talent for theater as he performed a flawless imitation of a gaping Magikarp out of water. Mewtwo was right to have kept this otherworldly human under a comatose state with its psychic powers. It was also right in arriving at the verdict that this human would be a linchpin to his organization. A chuckle escaped his lips, followed by another, then another, and soon he was cackling like the nefarious villain that he was. XXX, gentlemen. Tony, a 30-year-old who was sentenced to 25 years behind bars, stopped eating his bland food when that voice echoed through the cafeteria. He idly scanned his surroundings to find that his prison mates had also stopped eating as Team Rocket's leader was addressing them. It was only this morning when the man invaded the prison and killed every on-duty guard to show the residents that he meant business. Nothing was known about the leader prior to this. Hell, no one even knew his name. Yet the man had nonchalantly aired all of that, and there was no reason to deny his claims because of the brutal show he had put on for all of them. At first he thought Giovanni had come to recruit them, but he was quick to shut the lid on that, as there was no way such a salient criminal would concern himself with talent scouting. It flabbergasted everyone when the man proceeded to explain that he wanted all of them to engage in combat with one of his operatives. Should they defeat this person in battle, they'd be set free and be allowed to return to civilization once more. They were even handed a Pokeball each and a weapon of their choice to better their odds. He couldn't believe it when the man said they'd need all the help they can get. None of them were going to question it, however, because this was too good an opportunity to pee up. It's time, continued Giovanni, his eyes roaming over the emblage of prisoners from his undisclosed location. Remember. Win, and you're free. The mic cut out, but the man's voice was replaced by a screech from the west wing of the cafeteria where a fenced gate was located. There were only 2 entrances, and the first one got locked behind them, while this one was through which guards entered. None of the prisoners could see anything beyond it as it was pitch black. Then, through the darkness came the glow of 2 cerulean blue eyes, like sallow lamplight 8 feet off the ground. Tony clenched the gun he had requested as his weapon of choice. With each step this newcomer took towards them, it felt like the anxiety was being replaced with limp limbs as death poked into the back of his head like tiny needles. Dark trousers blanketed his muscular legs, but because he was donning no shirt, it revealed to all a physique that not many men could ever hope to achieve. 2 Meve boulders sat atop his shoulders, supporting large biceps the size of the average man's head. His bare chest was protruded far out, and then there were the solid engravings on his abdomen, marking it with the certification of 6-pack abs. My name is Naruto, stated the shinobi, his spiky gold hair scintillating under the spotlights, his voice as empty of life as a crypt. And I'm here to kill you. Oh, yeah? Roared Jason, one of the more stentorian inmates. How about I kill you instead, you piece of shit? A pocket knife was his weapon, and it made sense considering he was referred to as Knife Reaper in Kanto. This moniker was appointed to him because he used to hang around in alleys, waiting for anyone foolish enough to step into his domain. The only reason why he got caught was because he stabbed an undercover Kanto police chief. He was planning to escape, but some bastard tipped him off before he could get out of the region. Maneuvering the pocket knife in his hand, he took off in a sprint, his eyes locked on the blonde. Unfortunately, the man sidestepped him before drawing his arm back and slamming a fist into his gut. It wasn't the first time he was getting walloped, but right now it felt like his organs were getting squeezed through his skin as the once hard bones along in his body crumbled like breadcrumbs. The pain was excruciating, so much so that his anger faded and was replaced by blankness. Gagging out saliva and blood, the life disappeared from his eyes as he sank to his knees, the contact feeling like a nail bomb had exploded in his kneecaps. The Knife Reaper was no more. Pathetic, commented Naruto, glancing over at the stunned crowd from over his shoulder. Who's next? Tony couldn't believe it, but it was clear as day that his prison mate was dead. Somehow, this young man had managed to kill Jason with just a punch. He exhaled slowly as the blonde kicked the man's lifeless body aside and began sauntering towards them. Dread started creeping up from the deepest reaches of his mind, making him hallucinate as killing intent began rolling off the man. Hanging around with criminals all his life helped him to get a read of people with a single glance. However, he found no soul in those blue eyes. They were merely biological cameras, devices for image transfer cast in collagen, fat and neurons. It! Cried Henry, the ex-leader of the Kanto Hellraisers gang, having conniptions over the instant fatality. He reached for his Pokeball, wasting no time as he released the electrike that was handed to him. Use Thunderbolt. Fry that bastard. The male electrike obediently got into his stance and began channeling the necessary amount of energy required for his attack. Within seconds, lightning shot out of his mouth like a rip in the inky night, as if behind the dark canv was a brilliant light just waiting to flood through any crack no matter how infinitesimal. Treek. Die. Piped in Wayne, a Pokemon poacher so known for his brutality that it took a multi-regional search to hunt him down. Hovering around him was the Zubat he had released from her Pokeball. Good going, Henry. That'll show. Him. The decibel level of his voice progressively dipped in volume as words died down his throat. He should have been looking at charred remains, but the whiskered man was standing there without a scratch on him. If that wasn't bad enough, his eyes now appeared tundra cold and merciless, two pools of chilling, draconic blue. Yo. Let's get this He can't take us all. Excellent, thought Giovanni with a chortle, perusing the battle from the comfort of the prison's control center as the inmates charged forward, accompanied by their respective Pokemon. It happened faster than the cameras could register it, but now the screen displayed bodies laying on the ground like ghoulish mannequins, the esophagus and arteries sticking out like so much corrugated and rubber tubing. It was as if a special effects team had worked overtime for some Friday the 13th movie set. Experimenting could only take his scientists so far as they soon came to a dead end. Cloning the blonde was out of the question as every attempt was a debacle, even with multiple samples of his DNA. Mewtwo had told him that it wouldn't be able to keep the man in a stasis for much longer, so they were on borrowed time. It didn't help that the creature had informed him that there were other entities within the blonde that it could sense. Fortunately, it was able to erect a wall within the blonde's mind, though it was a transient fix because there were a plethora of triggers that could undo it. The remedy to this was enlisting the services of a Dr. Liam, a black market neurologist. With this collaboration, the psychic was able to tie this barrier to the shinobi's emotions and memories, both of which it had also sealed up, making it impossible for him to break out of it, and thus turning him into the ultimate weapon. Back downstairs, Naruto landed in front of his 160th victim. With just a finger coated in a blue energy, he was piercing through the tattoo of the man's baby's name. It went right on through to bleed the heart that beat for his lover. With just that finger, he sliced the chest that had witnessed a million kisses and wrapped its protection around his son in their everlasting hugs. The most prominent of scars traveled from his forehead to his jaw, right across his right eye. Yet none of that mattered to him as this weakling's blood was as red as any other. He glanced down at the now lifeless husband and father before turning his attention to the person closest to him. Channeling fire chakra to all 5 fingers of his right hand, he shunshined beside the man and placed his hand on his shoulder. Burn, bitch. ARRGGGHHHH, screeched Mason, a low-ranked thug, as the fire began melting the flesh from his body. He tried his very best to make a run for it, but there was no escaping the blonde as he had somehow managed to paralyze him. The fire quickly engulfed him, rendering him blind to everything else in the world as every part of his body became no more than a borrowed element forged in a star. A sickening smell of metal and rotting flesh was now blanketing the air in a choking aroma. Tony felt like he should have been used to it by now, but the strings these scenes were pulling hit him like a wave. Everywhere he looked there were dead bodies of humans and Pokemon alike. They had tried using axes, guns, knives, hammers, but this monster was immune to all of it, and now there was nowhere for them to flee. Several had tried, only to die a painful death. He fought back the exigency to vomit as he stared down at his cellmate. Todd's once lively skin was now drab, gray, his eyes staring off into space, but he couldn't tell what it was the man was looking at or for. Stay away, sobbed Jack as he backed himself into a corner. He didn't even know what hit him. All he could remember was a gust of wind and then a million razor blades began ripping him and his Abra to shreds. The Pokemon had tried protecting him, only to perish in the process. He was barely hanging by a thread now as his clothes were torn by the attack, the majority of his upper body now decorated with bloody lacerations. Naruto approached the downed figure, lifted him off the ground before slamming him back against the wall, but with so much force that he obliterated the man's spine. Jack tried to scream, but the hand around his neck simply turned that into a high-pitched gurgle. Die. Tony couldn't turn away fast enough, so he was now being subjected to the horrific visual of his prison mate's head getting ripped off his shoulders. The lifeless body fell to the ground, while the detached head was being chucked over to the corner of the cafeteria. A lone eyeball floated on the river of blood, only to be crushed under the feet of their emotionless assailant. We're doomed. There were about 20 of them left, but only a rare few hadn't accepted their fate. One such individual was Tracy, who dashed forward with his golem in tow, only for the blonde to blur out of existence. In the blink of an eye, his Pokemon was soaring through the air. There was a noticeable crack in the creature's natural armor when it crashed into the wall behind him. Getting over his shock, he lunged to his right with a twist of his wrist, using the momentum to swing his sword. Unfortunately, the man caught his weapon with his right hand. Roared Tracy as his foe flipped him over and proceeded to dig his knee into his back. No, don't, but his cries went unentertained as the blonde began folding his arm over towards the other side of his body. The pain continued to spike until a blood-curdling scream echoed through the cafeteria as his shoulder popped out of place. He could barely see out of his bugged-out eyes as he got kicked onto his back. Crawling away proved fruitless as the blonde appeared in his field of vision, holding onto the sword that he was going to use to injure him. His last few seconds on Earth were then spent shrieking at the top of his lungs as his opponent began swinging down repeatedly, slicing him up into dinner-ready pieces as his organs joined those of his prison mates in an ocean of crimson. Tony began sobbing hysterically, undergoing fear the likes of no other. This man was toying with them earlier, but it was clear they were going to get tortured now. Seconds felt like hours as he watched the blonde accost Randy, a cop who had raped hundreds of women while pretending to protect and serve. Even the whiskered ninja's chuckle had a gravely aspect to it as it echoed like a deep sepulchre. The bloodbath that ensued was just a poignant reminder that he was next. But there was no way that he would perish like his comrades had. If he was going to die, it was going to be on his own terms. Raising his shaking hand, he brought his gun over to his forehead. Bang. XXX the cacophony of vociferous, feminine shrieks and masculine grunts echoing from afar drowned out the men openly lusting over her. It wasn't the first time she was hearing such filth, and so she didn't pay it any mind, despite scunnered with them. Pink tresses swayed as she picked up the pace, though her hat remained in place. Her bubble butt wobbled around within her dress until she came to a screeching halt outside the door where the sounds were originating from. She stepped inside, only to find Jessie, a Team Rocket operative, getting the shit ed out of her. Minning GGG. Hollered the red-haired villain, her big tits swinging up and down, ripples running through her derriere as a muscular man slayed her forever ruined butthole from behind. His hands were coiled around her neck, applying just the right amount of pressure, causing sparks to go off in her field of vision as juices gushed from the depths of her vagina. And because she was getting ed up her fluids were free to splash on the ground and ricochet off into different areas of the bedroom. Her legs were shaking long before this, but this violent orgasm had made her feel like she was at the mercy of an earthquake. Everything in a 5-meter radius was now decorated in her juices as he persisted with draconian thrusts, draining every ounce of fluid from her cunt. None of the rockets she's fornicated with could compare to this indefatigable young man, nor could any of them hold a candle to his weapon of vaginal destruction. She had heard all about him from her colleagues, the majority of whom he had screwed senseless. She just never thought he'd end up banging her too. It wasn't even like he chatted her up. He just stormed over to her today, tore off her clothes in front of James and Meowth, and began dragging her down the hall. She was humiliated as dozens of her comrades saw her, but none of them batted an eye because this was a praxis. Not once had he spoken to her during the rounds of mating, and not once had she spotted a single emotion from him. She was obviously just a plaything to him. Naruto. That stern voice was barely over normal decibel level, yet he visibly recoiled like she had spoken in an ear-shattering frequency. He stopped working his hips, much to the relief of his battered UAL conquest. Lifting his head, he saw a narrow-eyed Nurse Joy, who had a deep frown marring her countenance, her hands clamped over her childbearing hips. There was pandemonium in his cerebral cortex whenever she was near, and this time was no different. He silently withdrew from Jessie, and the haggard woman collapsed to the ground like a sack of potatoes. "You have some explaining to do," said Nurse Joy, sashaying over to the whiskered ninja whose colossal cock was now glistening under the spotlights. "I can't believe you're putting me through this again." The peccant shinobi gnashed his teeth together, so caught up in screwing the redhead that he hadn't expected the nurse would catch him in the act. To make matters worse, his ears picked up on another pair of footsteps, and now an apoplectic Officer Jenny was stepping inside his room. Oh, great. He used to throw caution to the wind as Giovanni had given him free rein over the women in Team Rocket. He left no pussy or hole unturned as he had every female agent he laid eyes on. It mattered not if they were in relationships because there was nothing like breaking a woman who was spoken for. Furthermore, whenever the leader sent him off on a mission, he made it a point to screw the hottest older woman in that area before getting to work. Like when he was eyeing to gather intel on Lance, he took a trip to Blackthorn City and cajoled Claire into a night of hardcore. There was no bitchiness left in her as he enslaved her to his cock. She was so thoroughly seduced, in fact, that she obediently called Lorelei to join them when he ordered her to. The Elite Four member wasn't even a challenge for him, not that she ever stood a chance to begin with. Not only was Lance's cousin now under his control, so was the man's teammate. It was ineffable how beneficial this mission ended up being for the criminal organization. When Giovanni sent him to Rhoda to find out more about Mew, he masqueraded as a traveler and bedded Queen Eileen. It surprised him that she was a virgin, but he had no quarrels with deflowering Her Highness. Mew had been a no-show, probably because it must have sensed his presence in the area. What he uncovered about Aura, though, was a goldmine as he took with him thousands upon thousands of pages of ancient text on the subject. Mewtwo was there to accompany him to Rhoda, just as it had whenever he was eyeing a mission outside of Team Rocket headquarters. Giovanni said this was to ensure his safety, and while he could sense that there was an ulterior motive behind this, he couldn't deny that the pros of buddying up outweighed the cons. After all, the Pokemon's psychic abilities proved most useful for breaking the mental barriers of all of these women. Included in his, at earliest convenience, list were Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny, but all of that changed when Giovanni put him in charge of the game center in Celadon City. Seducing them was also imperative since they were among the most connected individuals on the planet. There was a lot the pink-haired lady did for the city other than heal Pokemon. The center also acted as a hotel where trainers can stay for a night or two, so she had first-hand knowledge as to who was coming in and going out of the city. Officer Jenny, on the other hand, knew the city in an entirely different manner because she was privy to sensitive information about the residents. He normally took off like a thief in the night after having his way with his latest conquest, meaning he never saw them again after the fact. Unfortunately, he was in a quandary from the second he laid eyes on the nurse. Her smile was more than just from her mouth as he heard it in her voice, her words and the way she relaxed. It was one of happiness growing, much as a spring flower opens, which in turn invoked hitherto foreign feelings in him. The same thing happened with the police officer, despite her not being as jaunty and sweet as her childhood friend. He was in the nadir of his life as the days went by and he couldn't stop seeing them, which was horrifying since his brain couldn't compute these urges. It was common knowledge that Jenny and Joy were family names, but it was rare for anyone to know the first names behind the women in uniform. Joy's first name was Stephanie, whereas Jenny was Ava. Feelings were for the weak, and he never had a problem with being detached, but now he was conflicted as they spilled their hearts to him with each ping day. Little did he know, the mental wall which housed his sealed-off emotions started to wither as one particular emotion began slipping through the crack. So when it was time to leave Celadon, he ended up kidnapping them while they slept. Back then they had no idea he was affiliated with Team Rocket. It wasn't until after they awoke in the headquarters that they realized that they've not only been sleeping with the same man, but that he was a criminal. Needless to say, things didn't go well for him as he was subjected to a ranting Ava and a woebegone Stephanie, both out of heartbreak. Rather than subjugate them, he tried easing their nerves by explaining that he had to take them with him. Why? Was a loaded question and he hadn't the foggiest clue how to answer it, he just had to. He even stopped Mewtwo from bewitching them because he also couldn't stomach the idea of them under mind control. It was so weird. Things slowly fell into place as the women eventually found their rhythm. There was a region-wide red alert out for them, which was still ongoing. However, they couldn't show themselves because they had decided to stay with their lover. Stephanie found it easier to cope than her harem sister because she was still healing Pokemon, though her job now catered to evil people. Ava, on the other hand, had begun aiding and abetting criminals by using her investigative skills against those she had sworn to protect. "I want to know as well," piped in the green-haired law enforcer as she drew closer to her perficuous boyfriend. "Now talk." He turned his head and raked her with icy contempt, though he had trouble conjuring the words to respond to her with. His decision to Jessie today had all to do with her failing to capture that Ash kid. She was a relatively new hire, but was he supposed to sit back and ignore that? The brat wasn't even remotely close to being on Team Rocket's radar. Having had enough of her incompetence, he decided to punish her by splitting open her hole. Slap. A raucous smack resounded through the room as Officer Jenny swatted him across the face, instantly hurling him out of his thoughts. The anger he felt was unimaginable. However, it took a backseat to the sensations coursing through him from seeing the pain on her face. It started off with a subfusc sting, like a needlepoint, but then it began burning around his innards more thoroughly than boiling water. His whisker marks stretched as he clicked his teeth. Had it been any other woman, he would have taken her against her will and railed on her until she was a husk of her former self. So why was he so weak when it came to these two? "Stop, Ava," interrupted Stephanie, wiping her compionate eyes with one hand while pulling her harem sister away with her other. "Naruto made a mistake. Okay. Let me handle this. Get Jessie out of here and then come back as soon as possible." "Whatever," sneered the officer as she spun on her heels and reached for the now unconscious Team Rocket member. This was the first time she had slapped her boyfriend, but she felt justified doing it because he was cheating on her. Steph obviously didn't count. Naruto was dark and mysterious when they first met, and as a police officer she was drawn to him. Unlike her former boyfriends, he was a quintessential mime when it came to expressing himself, so getting a read on him was a rigmarole, which in turn made him all the more enticing to the law enforcer in her. When it came down to them jumping into bed together, he put every man she's ever been with to shame, not just by having the biggest cock she's ever seen, but also by being a UAL aficionado. At first she was consumed by the pion, but was soon able to spot a glimmer of affection through his body language, facial expressions and tone of voice, despite all of it swimming in a sea of lust. Even prior to dragging her out of Celadon, she knew there was something seriously wrong with his mental state. He was besotted with her, so he didn't want her to leave, and she genuinely found herself wanting to stay. She was still getting used to the fact she was inside a criminal organization. She still wasn't used to it when she saw him defiling Executive Ariana in front of the woman's comrades. It was like he didn't comprehend the concept of being in a committed relationship. Wasn't it enough that he had kidnapped her? Wasn't it enough that she agreed to share him with her childhood friend? The pink-haired woman was too shaken up about it back then, so it was up to her to admonish him. He was probably more shocked than she was acrimonious, but at least her outburst made him stop fooling around. It was made clear to her from that point on that she was getting to him and that he was starting to do better. Well, not towards humans in general, but at least as far as her and her harem's sister were concerned. And now he went and pulled this shit. Let's sit, Naruto, said Stephanie with a sigh as she tugged on her boyfriend's hand enough for him to relent, allowing her to lead over to the bed. She sat him down, unbothered by his glare because it lacked bite, though no one in Team Rocket would have agreed with her on that. He was enraged from getting slapped, but she could see that he was expecting it from Ava. The woman acted before thinking sometimes. Reaching from under the hem of her dress, she began peeling down her panties and smoothly stepped out of them. She then took off her hat, letting the top of her pretty hair free. Setting it down on the ground, she reached down and took off her shoes, revealing her pretty pink toenail-painted feet. Hiking her uniform dress up past her hips, she proceeded to climb on top of the bed by placing a hand on his shoulder as leverage. She then planted her feet on either sides of his thighs, thus positioning herself above his aching pillar. He was so huge that she was forced to do this every time she wanted to ride him. As a stalwart nurse, she was not only dealing with Pokemon, but also monitoring the health of the Team Rocket operatives. Such a task involved ensuring the female members weren't carrying any UAL diseases since a majority of them were going off on seduction missions. Jessie had always cleared the test, which was why she hadn't jilted him or ordered him to wash himself. Haranguing him wasn't going to solve anything, but she knew what would. Slowly and steadily, she reached down with her free hand to grab his prodigious cock and point it directly at her pussy. In no time, she was stabbing herself with his oversized mushroom head. Oh. Mewled Nurse Joy, a heavy fog rolling in over her mind as her outer labia parted like the Red Seas, granting him page inside her. The sensation of getting stretched by him was one that never got old, no matter how many times they engaged in coitus. Sinking deeper into a squat, she welcomed in a solid 5 inches of his shaft, and soon his rigid core of raw masculinity began maging the nerve endings in her loins. Naruto drew out a long, satisfied sigh as he brought his arms under the nurse's dress and gathered her delectable booty into his hands. Women were a dime a dozen, but there was something magical about Stephanie. It wasn't that she would somehow manage to retain her tightness after every round of. It wasn't even the fact her cooch would always snuggle his cock like a little girl clinging to her teddy bear. Being inside her was like having an out-of-body experience as her sacred pageway spoke to his manhood in ways only it could understand as his brain was too primitive to decipher it. Ava and I trusted that you'd keep your word when you said you would stop having with your comrades, said Stephanie as she pressed her forehead against his. There are no words to describe how much you've hurt me today, Naruto. He opened his mouth, only to hold back his tongue. The argument didn't hold merit because he never said he would stop having with other women. By the time Executive Ariana had reached his radar, he had already cycled through a plethora of rocket bitches he couldn't for the life of him remember. But with his girlfriends, he hated that they had self-appointed themselves as such. Catching him in the act, he had to come up with some hogwash. It was true that he stopped ing other women since then. How he managed to do it rattled his mind, but what threw him for a loop was the satisfaction he felt while thinking about it. However, his monster cock was inexorable after discovering that Jessie had failed her mission. A part of him knew it was iniquitous, but that's exactly why he did it. Unfortunately, ing her only made things worse for him. It wasn't because he got caught, but because they didn't compare to what he had with his lovers. There were foreign sensations that would course through him whenever he ate them, almost consuming him whole each time. These sensations were the reason why he kidnapped them in the first place. If there was anything worse than an incensed Ava, it was a lugubrious Stephanie, and what he was seeing and hearing was unbearable. The pain speared through him as though he was taking a knife to the heart. I'm sorry, and I forgive you, whispered Nurse Joy without skipping a beat, which couldn't be said for her heart. She began rotating her hips, sensually milking the mammoth shaft pulsating within her. She knew full well how difficult it was for him to apologize. Hell, this was only the second time he did so, the first being when she caught him with Ariana. But I want to drive home to you once again that this is a two-way street, continued the nurse, now in a more serious tone. You took me away from my friends and family, so you need to own up to your duty as my boyfriend. Do you understand? It was emasculating, but he gnawed on his bottom lip while bobbing his head. This wasn't the first time she was belaboring him about how asinine it was for him to expect her and Ava to be faithful when they were the ones sharing, while he was collecting the fruits of their labor. When he brought them here, He had every intention of you ally beating obedience into them, though he choked when the time came. Ava had openly launched a diatribe against him. However, Stephanie shocked him by not only accepting it, but also persuading her friend to think differently. Just like those past times, hearing her now triggered the organ responsible for pumping blood to his system. People called it the heart, but to him it was the ing thing responsible for subjecting him to these deranged sensations. Yes. Thank you, said the pink-haired woman, her eyes sparkling with the emotion she and her cousins were typically referred to by. She began raising and dropping her hips, cramming the last few inches of her lover's shaft inside her, stabbing herself with all 15 inches of his cock. She whimpered as his giant testicles nuzzled against her engorged clitoris, while her exquisitely rounded tush ballooned out on his muscular thighs. His hold on her felt amazing, but she wanted him to mage her, to run his big, strong hands all over her back and toy with her hair. She wanted him to kiss her with the tenderness she knew he was capable of, towards her at least. She was soon granted all of these wishes, but she had to take the first step by pressing her lips against his. They sank like a ball of fire landing on a blanket of snow, molding together in perfect harmony. She closed her eyes, moaning softly into his parted mouth as he deepened the kiss and began trailing his hands up her butt, enrapturing her every step of the way. Kissing wasn't his favorite pastime since he had a predilection for fornicating with no questions asked. But every time Stephanie kissed him, it always left him wanting more, so much so that he found himself peculating kisses from her every now and then. Her bountiful tits were pressed tightly against his chest, with only her dress and bra protecting her hardened nipples from his skin. Her pussy was magical as it gripped him like a vice, with each movement from her hips kindling a fire in his loins. It was beyond his ken how this gentle lovemaking could bring him to such heights of pleasure when brutal, hardcore, no strings attached with women like Jessie didn't do shit for him. Mewled Nurse Joy, her eyes glossing over as she gradually picked up the pace, just enough for her vagina to really feel the stretch as the blonde began hammering into the ingress of her cervix. It was then she felt him wrap his arms around her back like he wanted her to stay with him forever. She opened her eyes to see his were closed, and the look on his face proved to her that she wasn't clinging onto false hope. She hungrily coiled her tongue around his, engaging him in a dance of saliva while he commenced with weaving his hands through her pink hair. By this point his mate had stopped riding him. Instead, she began grinding her hips, working his shaft with her vaginal muscles. It didn't take much effort to subdue her tongue, and so now he was greedily pillaging her oral caverns, leaving no survivors as he conquered her mouth. At long last, he pulled away, and a thick strand of saliva oozed out of his mouth, acting as a bridge between their parted lips. "Take that dress off." She panted heavily, her palms cradling the back of his head. She was already flushed from their pionate make-out session, but now her cheeks were positively suffused with color. Nodding bashfully, she unwrapped her arms from his neck and reached for the hem of her uniform. With a quick, smooth jerk, she yanked it up to her shoulders, causing her delicious breasts to plop out and bounce to a stop in front of him. But this wasn't all that he wanted, and so she reached behind her to unhook her bra. Round, luscious, and firm, the nurse's tits were a work of art as they created a natural chasm of succulent cleavage. Her nipples were as hard as diamonds, jutting out from her round areolas, aching to be ed and nibbled on. He hungrily drank it all in as she tossed her garments aside, always admiring the way her globes jiggled with each slight movement she made. Sliding his hands down, he cupped her heaving flesh, squeezing them, digging into them with his fingers, immersing in their fullness and softness. His whisker marks curled upward, mimicking his grin as he pointed her hard, throbbing left nipple at his face, getting it poised for what was to come. "Oh, Naruto!" cried Nurse Joy as her boyfriend lunged forward, taking her erect nub into his mouth like a Snorlax at an all-you-can-eat buffet. She instinctively snaked her arms around his neck while bringing a hand to the back of his neck. Although this was done out of natural reflex, all this had done was force more of her nipple into his mouth. Her fingers of that head cradling hand scraping his scalp, she yanked him into her chest, all while grinding her hips with exigency, a thick, creamy froth running down the length of his cock as she began creaming down on him. She mewled like a cavelling kitten as his teeth scraped against her skin, lavishing her nipple until it was captured between his lips as he formed a tight seal around it. Since the tempo of her riding was tortuously slow, she could feel every vein on his 15-inch cock as it explored her vagina. At no time did he bother to unlatch from her tits. In fact, his left hand was busy groping her left tit, forming deranged shapes with it while his jaw was working hard as he relentlessly ed her nipple. She was already speaking in intonations, but now she had lost the ability to enunciate words, so all that escaped her was a chain of guttural babbles. Beads of sweat started rolling down the sides of her contorted face while her toes started to curl up. Finally, the pleasure engulfed her and she began clawing helplessly at his hair while her eyes rolled to the back of her head. "I'm Min GGG," hollered the pink-haired lady, stars dancing in her field of vision as an orgasm ripped through her body like molten fire. She bucked her hips wildly as her pussy muscles tightened around his erection, bathing him in steaming juices. It was never a problem for her in the past, but being with him was different. She was overcome by latude and staying awake was proving onerous. She wasn't sure where she was, but it was a peaceful place, a place where all the world's problems ceased to exist. XXX Officer Jenny chewed on her bottom lip, idly clenching her thighs together as she watched a glob of thick, creamy nectar sprinkle out of her whimpering harem sister as their boyfriend slammed her down on his cock a final time. It was nearly 30 minutes ago when she arrived back into the bedroom, only to find the couple making love. Sharing the blonde wasn't a piece of cake, but at least the other woman wasn't a stranger. After all, she had grown up with Steph in Celadon and the two of them have always had a sororal friendship. "Ava." She exhaled deeply as she met her whiskered lover's gaze. "Save it." But instead of heeding to her warning, he proceeded to lift her best friend off his lap. Inch by inch his monster cock came into view, glistening with an abundance of the nurse's juices. The pinkette in question was foaming at the pussy as her fluids were now free to escape the vacuum that the blonde's cock had created. Now the lady was laying on her side. From this angle she couldn't see her face, but judging from the way her body was rising and falling, it was obvious that the woman had ped out. She was still a lightweight. He was about to attempt another retort when she glared at him, conveying that she wasn't in the mood to listen right now. Stephanie could be as sweet as she wanted to in her approach, but that was not her scene. She began sashaying towards him, her big tits jiggling beneath her police-issued shirt. But unlike her friend, who had straddled the blonde, she came to a halt and knelt down between his legs. Her big stretched out the fabric of her skirt as she placed herself at eye level to his crotch. "Lee, it's not bad enough that you turned me into a criminal?" hissed Ava, despite knowing she was calumniating her boyfriend. He had seduced her, sure, but he never forced her to do shit. Not even Giovanni had the power to send her off on missions because Naruto had made it clear that she and Stephanie weren't recruits, and that they belonged to him. He was possessive of her since the day they met, but seeing him stand up to his boss drove home to her this was never going to be a dalliance. Perhaps it was asinine, but love can make people do crazy things, things they never thought they'd ever do. She did some egregious things, but all of them were justifiable to her because she was with him. Justifying today's mission of breaking into Vermilion City's online banking system, however, was not as simple. Just like the time when she caught him with Executive Ariana, seeing him with Jesse gave her every reason to doubt her future with him. Be that as it may, she knew deep down that while he was an obstinate man, there was something about him that was worth fighting for. The laborious look on his face informed her that he was sorry and that he realized he had done wrong by her, meaning her friend must have gotten through to him. But she wasn't the nurse, and she wasn't willing to listen. "Do it again, and we're done. Am I clear?" He bobbed his head, but didn't follow it up with a verbal covenant, which was good since she didn't want to hear it right now. Placing her hands on his thighs, she raised herself on her heels, now directing her attention to the throbbing piece of meat in front of her. Her smooth lips parted as her mouth opened, the zephyr of her warm breath caressing the head of his wet. As her lips got closer, just millimeters from making contact, she pulled back as the scent of her harem sister's pussy was overwhelming the natural musk of his cock. It wasn't the first time she'd be ing him off after he had wrapped up a mating session with Stephanie. However, the current situation was different since she was not a happy camper right now. Despite this, she bit the bullet and now her cheeks were swelling obscenely as the giant mushroom head speared through her parted lips and penetrated her oral cavity. Her harem sister's juices barely registered on her taste buds because she was so busy inhaling as much of the blonde as he could. She began to pull back, letting some of his cock escape the volcanic confines of her mouth as she lifted herself to the tip, leaving only that inside. She then worked up a rhythm, bobbing up and down on the top half of his shaft, taking it further and further. "That's a good girl," groaned the Jinchuriki, forgetting all about his inner turmoil as the police officer began ing his cock. His cerulean blue orbs coruscated as he placed a hand on her uniformed hat, his palm resting on her head. It was enthralling to feel her hot tongue maging his cock from within her mouth, her cheeks swelling around his girth, her lips wrapped around his shaft, her throat enveloping the head of his erection. Nurse Joy always made love to their boyfriend, no matter if she was performing fellatio on him or if she was having with him. This didn't surprise Officer Jenny in the slightest since she'd grown up with the girl. She, on the other hand, was wild since childhood, which was why she joined the Kanto police force, to chase the thrill and excitement. This carried over into her love life as she always gave it her all in every round of. She was even more relentless than usual this time around, but it made sense considering her current emotional state. MHMHM, came Officer Jenny's muffled moan, her mouth filled to the brim with criminal meat. Tears pooled in her eyes from taking too much at once, but she continued ing with ferocity despite now gagging on him. She even went as far as carving space in her throat to take even more. Creamy froth started dribbling down her occupied lips, oozing down her chin, marking her skin with a combination of her saliva and his pre. The timing of this was perfect as her pussy began weeping through her thong and her overflowing juices started dribbling down the sides of her legs. He threw his head back, though his eyes never left the cock-ing police officer and his hand never left her hat-donning head. From this angle, he saw the back of her hat as she fulfilled her duty of serving the general public by servicing his weapon of vaginal destruction. It also provided him with the vista of the sides of her tits even from behind, the smooth flesh jiggling, begging to be freed from her shirt. But what his eyes were drawn to the most was her magnificent bubble butt, which was now hanging out of her police skirt. Arceus, Ava. Craning his neck to his left, he looked to see his other partner glancing at them with her eyes full of wonder. "Why don't you join her, Stephanie?" Nurse Joy chewed on her bottom lip, but said nothing as she watched her harem sister whoring all over the blonde's cock. At first, she didn't want to join her, but it wasn't because she had never done so. When they arrived here, he took them straight to his room and concluded that they would be staying with him from now on. He didn't give them a chance to pick separate rooms, nor did they want to. After all, they were in the headquarters of a criminal organization, so it only made sense for them to be bunked together. Be that as it may, threesomes were not a common occurrence because she didn't feel comfortable with it, she much preferred being alone with the blonde. But when Ava's eyes met hers, she got on her knees, thrusting her butt out as she leaned over towards their boyfriend's crotch. His pole came springing out of the female officer's mouth, coruscating with her saliva. Ava was now holding onto it, both hands wrapped around the shaft, though it was so fat that not even a double-handed grip was enough to fully encircle him. The oleaginous cock was being offered to her as it was pointed at her mouth. Too shy to thank her, she lowered her head and began planting a long, smooth kiss on the cockhead. "That feels so good," groaned out Karama's host, placing his hand on the bent-over nurse's plump rump as she began taking his cock in her mouth, her tongue gently playing with it, coating it and maging it. He lost himself in the mix of sensations that her cocking routine was giving him, unable to say what felt better. Whether the maging friction of her tender hollowed-out cheeks, or the wet whirling suction of her mouth, or the smooth up and down of her cock-stretched lips gliding on his shaft, or the warm clenching grip of her swallowing gullet. That wasn't even the best part since Officer Jenny was still at work. Not only was she stroking his cock from the base up to the middle of his shaft, she was also forming a tight seal with her lips around his left testicle. It wasn't easy spotting it because her hat was shielding her eyes, not to mention his view was being mostly blocked by the pinkette's head bobbing up and down. But as Ava looked up, he saw the burning lust in her peripherals. He was going to blow soon, but he didn't want to do it in Stephanie's mouth since she wasn't much a swallower to begin with. It wasn't that she had never done it, her womb just had a penchant for him ejaculating deep inside her. As the nurse stopped ardently ing and began nibbling his cockhead, he slid his hand from her over until he was cupping the base of her chin. "Get the handcuffs," she sputtered, abashed by his order, but complied as she released his cock from her drooling mouth. Officer Jenny continued stroking his shaft and nursing his balls, unfazed by the departure. She most likely had no idea what he had even ordered since he spoke low enough that only the nurse could hear him. Having sat in the backseat for long enough, He pulled the police officer up by the sides of her hat-donning head and then began forcing his cock into her mouth. He promptly demolished any and all resistance she put up, and now she was obediently swallowing him into her oral caverns. For the next 20 seconds, his eardrums were blessed with the erotic melody of his choking and gagging green-haired mate as he drilled in and out of her throat. It was slightly uncomfortable since the bill of her hat rammed into his abdomen every time he bottomed out in her mouth, but the discomfort was well worth the scorching hot drool running down the base of his shaft, melting his testicles. It was then he saw Nurse Joy appearing out of the walk-in closet from the corner of his eye. In her hand was a pair of steel handcuffs, which were issued out to every officer in the region. "Cuff her." Ava heard the command this time, and her watery eyes widened as a myriad of emotions ripped through her, the most prominent being lust. But aside from drumming her fists against his thighs, she couldn't do much since he was rejigging her oral cavity with his cock. Just then, she felt her arms being reeled behind her, and almost as quickly felt the cool metal of a handcuff around her right wrist. Even through her muffled moans she heard the clicking of the metal as her harem sister adjusted the latch until it was a little too tight for her. In a matter of seconds, the latch closed on her other wrist as well. She tried to pull her hands apart, but to no avail. This was the first time her harem sister was tying her up, as her boyfriend was the one who always did it. Celadon City was renowned for its peacefulness, but a few years ago Stephanie was robbed at gunpoint. She decided then to teach her how to apprehend criminals, with one such lesson catered to the art of handcuffing. So lost in her thoughts, she unconsciously made an attempt to extricate her arms from the cuffs as the metal began cutting into her wrists. "MMPHHH!" screamed the greenette into her lover's cock as he held her head down and truly began ing her face, her neck aching as her hat continually smashed into his abdomen. As a police officer, she never had many suitors because most men were scared of her. Those who managed to slip past the crack always proved to be useless in the sack because they were all intimidated by her. However, Naruto was different, especially in regard to his uncanny ability of dominating her without effort, which was why they meshed so well. She nearly lost consciousness as he pushed her head down when she tried yanking her mouth off him, following it by cramming his cock so deep in her throat that it felt like he was penetrating her lungs. Tears streamed down her contorted face, but she wasn't able to wrap her arms around his waist for leverage since her arms were still pinned hopelessly behind her back. All she could do to stay alive was breathe desperately through her nose while gagging and wailing, her frustration muddling with desire and lust as the heat between her legs grew to unfathomable levels. "Arceus," whispered Nurse Joy, a puddle forming beneath her trembling legs as she maged her clitoris. No matter how many times she bore witness to it, she was always left flabbergasted at how her harem sister could handle being abused like this. "How do you do it, Ava?" With his firm grip on the sides of his handcuffed partner's head, he yanked her off his cock. Thick strands of saliva drooled out of her mouth, running down her chin as she panted and gasped. By now her uniformed shirt was drenched with the amalgamation of her drool and tears, making her look positively irresistible. He stared down at her, watching as her tear-stained cheeks flushed a pretty cerise. On the bed. "Now." She bit back a mule as her lover barked his order, commanding her like she was a prisoner instead of a police officer. She precipitously wiggled out from between his legs and clambered onto the bed without the aid of her hands. Following his wordless instruction, she got on her knees, propping up her bottom while bowing her head, the bill of her hat digging into the comfortable sheets. In no time she felt his weight on the bed behind her and his hands snaking around her. It was almost painful as he slid his fingers up her clothed ribcage and around the curves of her breasts. Even through her shirt and bra, sensations were rolling through her body like electricity as he rolled her nipples between the pads of his fingers until they tightened. "Stephanie," said the Jinchuriki, now pinching the officer's hardened nipples through her clothes. "Pull her skirt up." Nurse Joy dug her fingers out of her vagina, blushing harder than her harem sister was right now. This was edging beyond her level of comfort, but she still crawled onto the bed at the blonde's behest. He was looming over the handcuffed Ava, so there wasn't much room for her to work with. It didn't help that his monster cock was basically resting all across woman's back. Still, she managed to use a single hand to hike her friend's skirt up past her hips. "Good girl," lauded Naruto, his enhanced ninja senses picking up on the officer's sensational booty jutting out and jiggling around, finally free from its fabric prison. Reluctantly, he removed his hands from under her heaving chest. Now I want you to play with yourself. I'm going to want that pussy again after I'm done with Ava. He chortled darkly as the nurse plopped down on the bed in embarrassment. There was no way he would settle for just that round of, he was going to her all day long. Applying pressure to his knees, his monster cock drew away from the green-haired lady's bare tush as he leaned back. Now he was drinking in the perfection that was begging to be touched and squeezed. Even the crevice between those doughy cheeks was wide, those two scrumptious cheeks pressed together in just the right way, hiding the delights in between. Officer Jenny's breath hitched as her boyfriend's fingers teased around her entrance for a moment before dragging them up her slit and over to her engorged clitoris. She whimpered and bucked her hips into his hand as he began to slide 2 fingers in tantalizingly slow circles over the sensitive bundle of nerves. The sensation was becoming unbearable for her, especially since she couldn't grip the sheets due to her being handcuffed. She lifted her head, her hat nearly sliding off since her hair was drenched with sweat. Me. Just me already, he obliged. Nurse Joy couldn't help but cry out as her boyfriend savagely penetrated her harem sister. Careful. Ava hollered to the heavens, her frabjous womb contracting as juices splashed from her depths from getting brutally stretched. Her mate's cock was almost identical in girth to her balled-up fist, so penetration would always prove challenging for her. She arched into him as he punched through every last one of her vagina's defenses. The greatest thing about it was that despite now banging into her cervix, he hadn't bottomed out yet. She lolled her head from side to side, the bill of her hat rubbing against the sheets, screaming as he rocked his hips again, and again, starting off hard and fast picking up the pace. The M of his heavy testicles began smashing against her engorged clitoris, making it want to take cover under its hood. Her tits bounced around within her shirt, and attempts to buck her wobbling hips proved futile because his thrusts were too arduous for her to match. It didn't help that her arms were still immobilized behind her back, so she couldn't use them to support her body. Suddenly, her mate grasped around the chain binding her 2 hands and pulled up. Her hat-donning head and shoulders were lifted from the pillow, and the cuffs cut into her wrists painfully. One of his hands then left her, though the one that remained was still forcing her to stare directly into the banal wall in front of her. Then, his free hand curled around the curls of her hair swaying out from under her hat. He then began tugging on it while nailing her like a slut. Her hat flew off from that one vicious thrust while a glob of saliva shot out of her mouth, and now she was caterwauling, overtaken by pleasure mingled with pain. Ming, whimpered Nurse Joy, sapid nectar squirting out of her as she continued digging her fingers into her snatch. Arceus, Naruto. But the blonde didn't hear her nor did the woman he was screwing. Ava now began bucking wildly, wet, squishy noises blending with their respective moans and grunts as each thrust from her boyfriend sent electric shocks through her torso and into her whole body. Waves of pleasure soon crashed over her as her back arched and toes curled, her heartbeat deafening in her ears. I'm ing mmminggg. Prepare to be bred, Ava, roared Naruto, his eyes flashing victoriously as he fought through the gushing police officer by bludgeoning her with his cock to the degree he became a blur. Her big, fat smacked against his abdomen while juices continually splashed out of her. On and on he pummeled her, forcing yet another orgasm out of her by the time he was delivering his last hip jerks. His testicles churned as fluid rushed up through his shaft and began exploding out of his urethra. Nurse Joy watched the familiar sight of her boyfriend ejaculating inside her harem sister, and her own pussy began yearning for him to fill her as well. The ungodly amount of semen he could produce was medically impossible for humans and Pokemon alike, but he could do it repeatedly. She was also gobsmacked by his stamina as he was able to last for hours on end without ever once going soft. There was also something magical about his jism. It was so potent that he could impregnate even the most infertile of women with ease. However, he was somehow able to render his seed sterile. When she asked him about it, he told her it was thanks to chakra, but she was completely unfamiliar with the subject, so she didn't pry deeper than that. The sound of metal on metal brought her out of her thoughts and now she saw her boyfriend releasing the greenette from her cuffs. The knackered officer sat up on the bed, rolling her sore shoulders while inspecting her slightly bruised wrists. An amalgamation of her juices and his jism continued bubbling out of her, despite her already sitting in a pool of their reproductive fluids. She turned her head, only to find him staring at her with emotions she knew were reserved only for her and her harem sister. Raising herself on her knees, she leaned up and smashed her lips against his, a warmth filling her chest that had nothing to do with her monumental orgasm. XXX, a smile curled to her lips as she inhaled the rich jasmine carrying through her garden. Splashes went off by her side, and she turned her head to find her son's crabby drumming his fist into the water.
The little guy never wasted an opportunity to pay her a visit from Professor Oak's lab.
She giggled, watching as the creature muttered his name at the Magikarp flopping around in her pond. Sashaying away from the duo, she admired the dandelions, roses and tulips, her all-time favorite flowers, decorating the backyard. This was her little piece of heaven. Mime, mime. She didn't dawdle as she sashayed towards the fence separating her garden from the outside world. Mimey wasn't a surly peaceful Pokemon. He was a jolly fellow, but she could tell from his tone of voice that he was alarmed. Vexed by this, she stepped out the fence to find him glaring up at a stranger, his arms flailing around as he naturally acted out a pantomime. She was taken aback as the golden rays of the sun bounced off the newcomer's blonde spikes. His form was Herculean, as he was packing so much muscle that it was obscenely stretching his shirt. She swallowed a lump in her throat as he canted his head. All at once, she found herself drowning in the ocean that was his cerulean blue eyes. Her heart was racing as she snapped back to reality before the waves consumed her whole. What was that? Hi, my name is Naruto, said the blonde, his voice starting off calm, cool and collected, but slowly dying down to a mere whisper. Rich, silky strands of milk chocolate tresses cupped the sides of the lady's face while the rest flowed well down her shoulders. She wasn't exactly dressed like a hot MILF, but she was rocking a nurturing mommy look. Even through her clothes, the impeccable symmetric geometric perfection hidden beneath was obvious. Moreover, the tantalizing curve of her hips told him stories of the delicious amount behind it, though he couldn't confirm it from this angle. It's nice to meet you, Naruto, replied Delia hoarsely, still not 100% back yet. I'm Delia Ketchum. May I ask why you're out on my property? Likewise, Delia. Beautiful name, by the way, answered the shinobi, watching as a small red hue crept to the brunette's face. I was just pinged by Viridian City and somehow managed to end up in Pallet Town. Her bountiful tits jiggled as she giggled, her melodious laughter sweetening the afternoon air. Oh, I see. We don't get a lot of visitors, so I was just surprised. I hope you're not disappointed with our quaint little town. I was. But not anymore. The humor died down as Delia stood there for a moment, gnawing on her bottom lip while nervously fidgeting with her hands. Like a flamethrower firing off on a Bulbasaur, flirting was super effective against her. Over the years, she grew out of her girlish reactions to it, but it's been ages since a man this handsome had complimented her. Aye. Thank you. You're most welcome, said Naruto, pleased with how easily he was working his mojo on the MILF. Anyway, I guess I should get going. She was still embered, but hearing that helped her snap out of it. The host in her couldn't bear the thought of a first-time visitor to her town leaving without a home-cooked meal. No, please, Naruto. Please stay for dinner. Thank you, replied Naruto, not at all surprised that the bubbly mother had extended this offer to him. After all, he had used her desire to help others against her by hoodwinking her into inviting him into her home. He was about to follow her lead when the image of his lovers began plaguing his mind. Ing hell. XXX. Here you go, Mr. Zack, chirruped Nurse Joy, pushing a tray of Pokeballs towards her client. Your Pokemon are good as new. Thanks, replied the bearded Team Rocket member. Now about you heal my. Her heart sank in her stomach as the smile vanished from her idyllic face. This sort of commentary was common from the men here, but it didn't mean she was used to being treated like a piece of meat. She didn't get a chance to politely turn him down as the criminal promptly collapsed to the ground. He began thrashing around and was dead by the time she got to him. There was no need for her to investigate the cause of death because she knew a certain psychic user was behind this. Mewtwo. What seems to be the problem? Queried the Pokemon from deep within the headquarters walls, speaking to her via telepathy. Naruto demanded that I eradicate anyone who dares sully your name. I did just that. He never told you to kill, argued Stephanie as tears welled in her eyes. I will have a talk with Naruto about this. I'm trying to help him and you're making it worse by taking his requests literally. Do as you please, came its nonchalant retort. Speaking of Naruto, I do need to discuss something with you and it's of the utmost importance. Retreat to your private quarters. She immediately straightened up, her anger being replaced by trepidation. This must be really serious, especially since the Pokémon was bringing up her lover's name. She nodded, wasting no time as she left Zack's dead corpse with the rocket who had appeared while she was confabulating with Mewtwo. But if she thought about this death, she would sit there and cry, and the situation demanded otherwise. Trying her best to school her features, she made a beeline for the door behind her desk, pulled on the handle, opened the door and slammed it shut in one fluent motion. An effulgent light enveloped the room before she could call out for Mewtwo. When the light died down, she saw it standing there with her harem sister. "Mind telling me why you teleported me from my office and brought me here?" queried Officer Jenny as she placed her hands on her hips. "And it'd better be good. I was working a lead." The man-made creature blankly stared at her through its armored visor. "Naruto is on a mission and his job is to seduce Delia Ketchum." "What?" roared the greenette, so shocked with this response that her brain lagged in registering this as an anger-provoking statement. "I thought he was meeting with Giovanni, not going on a mission." Stephanie threw a hand over her mouth, the color draining from her face as those words sank in. "Why didn't he tell us this?" "He had no other choice," replied Mew's clone as it crossed its arms over its chest. "Naruto has been under scrutiny ever since he returned from Celadon City. With the exception of 2 isolated incidents, his conscious efforts to stop mating with women other than yourselves registered to Master Giovanni as the biggest red flag. There is no indication that he is privy to the fact you two are solely responsible for this vagary. What it purposely failed to disclose was that they were actively and successfully working towards destroying the mental barrier he had erected in the Jinchuriki's mind. Any and all attempts to rectify this has ended in failure, and while it knew better than to hold back this information from his master, it couldn't help but be amazed at how 2 humans were undoing all of this work. But maintaining this barrier was proving intractable now, which is what Giovanni feared, what it feared, and frankly something that everyone on the planet should fear. Ava gnashed her teeth together as she folded her arms against her luscious tits. A week has gone by since she caught her boyfriend railing on Jessie. Other than leaving for work, she and her harem sister had kept a watchful eye on him the entire time, which was a simple task since he hadn't left the headquarters since then. It started off as a snuggle here and there, but they were proud to note that he was doing tremendously. If they continued working with him, they were sure he would break out of his shell for good. Stephanie was unknowingly ruminating about the same issue as her friend. Had their lover repudiated this mission, it would have given Team Rocket's leader all the more reason to believe that he's longer the weapon that he once was. However, this was a seduction mission, meaning the blonde would have to get Yu-Eli involved with his target in order to complete it. She and Ava were there to stop him before, but now he had a green light to betray them. "How do we stop this?" "You are asking the wrong question," stated Mewtwo, annoyed by the emotions he could sense rolling off the ladies. "Perhaps I should have made my motive for convoking you to this meeting clear. Who Naruto copulates with makes no difference to me. I just wish to comprehend why he's going to fail this mission." The nurse narrowed her eyes. Naruto, failing a mission? As much as she didn't want him to succeed this time, she couldn't wrap her head around him not being able to complete something he had set his mind to. "I don't follow." "Neither do I," added Ms. Jenny, a part of her elated with the potential good news. "What the hell are you even talking about? Just teleport us to him. We'll take care of it." "Do that and your fate will be sealed," replied Mewtwo, much to the greenette's ire. "Just calm yourselves. Allow me to show you what I mean." The ladies both did as instructed, and soon images started flooding through their brains. They watched as their boyfriend laid eyes on Delia, heard every word as he conversed with her, and then joined her inside her home. Having been seduced by him in the past, they could tell where he was being candid and where he was playing with his victim. There was deceit, sure, but it didn't weigh anything close to how genuine he was being with the mother. It was a lot to take in, especially for their aching hearts, but they bore through the following scenes like the strong women they were. XXX. What the is this bullshit? Thought Naruto for the umpteenth time as he wasted yet another opportunity to defile this mother in her own home. Dinner ended up being a nightmare. Delia hadn't finished cooking at the time, but he ped on her offer to relax in the living room. Instead, he chose to tag along with her in the kitchen. He figured with how poorly she did with compliments, he could wrap this mission up in no time. Unfortunately, he was rendered immobile as he observed her shuffling about, her hazel orbs sparkling while animatedly talking about what she was going to prepare for them. Her hair swayed from side to side, carrying with it the scent of the most exquisite floral bouquets, the kind that would be there in the foyer of the theater upon its grandest of galas. Being with her reminded him of the first time he laid eyes on Stephanie in the Pokemon Center. She was playing with her Blissey at the time, laughing and giggling with them as they danced around. She had more than a decade on him, but she had the innocence of a little girl. It was hypnotizing. His encounter with Ava, on the other hand, didn't take place in the Celadon police station, it was on the outskirts of the city. She was apprehending a thief at the time, but that whole scenario had been orchestrated by him. True to his plan, he showed up just in the nick of time to provide his eye stance, but the entire time he was mesmerized from watching her in action. Things got worse after they left the kitchen. Kanto was in the start of the winter season, so there would be less daylight from here on out. Because of this, the rays seeping through the window in the dining hall lacked bite. Soft music played in the background, courtesy of Mr. Mime, who decided to take care of the dishes that had been used to prepare the food. That Pokemon definitely did not like him, not that it mattered. At least it wasn't actively trying to hinder him from proceeding with his task of seducing its owner. The spread was way too much for a dinner for two as Delia went all out. He commented as such back in the kitchen, but she waved him off, explaining that she wanted his impression of Kanto to be a memorable one. Before his two mates came around, he was eating whatever the chefs at Team Rocket headquarters had whipped up. If he was out on a mission, he'd fetch something from a local restaurant. His mates were accomplished cooks, and he was satisfied with their food, but this mother had put them both to shame with her culinary skills. There was no small talk made during dinner, which didn't work in his favor since the silence was deafening. And now they were in the living room with dessert. "Thank you all for joining us as we begin the prel. Sorry, Naruto," said Delia as she reached for the remote control beside her and used it to mute the television. "I didn't think the commentary would be so loud." The blonde shook his head, both to wave her off and also to ease off the roller coaster that was his thoughts. "It's fine. Thank you," added the brown-haired MILF. "I'd also like to apologize for turning on the TV all of a sudden, but my Ashi is battling soon and I can't afford to miss out on that." Try as he might, he failed in his attempt to barricade himself from the warmth bursting out of the mother as she spoke, practically bouncing on the sofa cushion. The barriers within his mind shook, just as they did during his encounters with Ava and Stephanie. It was shortly after dinner that he made the mistake of commenting on the picture frames of the kid decorating the main floor. And from that moment onward she couldn't stop blabbing about her son. The paean in her voice did a number on his brain, and despite his attempts to change the subject, she continued spilling every last one of his accomplishments. When it was all said and done, she had revealed more about the kid than even Team Rocket had on file. "Your son is competing in the Battle City tournament?" "Yes," twittered Delia brightly. "I take it you heard about this tournament in Ping during your travels?" She craned her head to find him staring not at the television, but directly at her, causing her abdomen to tighten as her heart fluttered. He didn't talk much about himself, though she knew she was to blame for that since she had monopolized all of their conversations thus far. All she truly knew about him was that he was in Kanto for some business. She was an open book with almost everyone, but there was something special about this young man. He was really mature for his age, and didn't exhibit the perverted tendencies that her son's friend Brock did. He was Meave, and it was embarrassing how many times she had admired his physique in the kitchen. It was ineffable, but there was an aura about him which comforted her. "That's correct," answered the blonde-haired criminal, not needing to lie about it. This tournament was in the works for over a year now and its purpose was to act as a mock simulation of sorts for those planning to compete in the Indigo Plateau Conference. The gym leader Sabrina was the mastermind behind this operation. The majority had speculated this had nothing to do with bringing traffic to Saffron City, but so the woman could prove to the general public that she was no longer a crazy psychic bitch. Delia was going to ask if her companion had also battled in the past when she caught a glimpse of her son on screen. Oh, there's Ashi. Everything derailed from there. The fight lasted 15 minutes in total, but it felt like an eternity. All he understood about the battle was what his eardrums picked up on since his attention was entirely on his target, who was glued to the screen. She had not spoken a word to him as she cheered on her son, almost as though she was in a trance the whole time. A wave of emotions were crashing over him as he observed her, analyzing the sheer delight on her face each time the boy defeated the opposing Pokemon. At long last, the living room exploded with her melodious voice as she bellowed with the love that only a mother can have for her son. Ash may have ended up winning the battle, but it was the kid's mother who had truly won here. Delia covered her mouth, yawning as exhaustion hit her like a truck. It was nearly 10 p.m. now, which was well past her bedtime. The only reason why she planned on sleeping late tonight was because she wanted to watch the live feed of her son's battle. Unfortunately, his phone was out of order, so she couldn't congratulate him right now. She'd have to wait until he got to a Pokemon Center, which most likely wouldn't be tonight. He had told her yesterday that he was going to camp on the outskirts of Saffron because of the horde of people visiting the city for the tournament. Eep! Squeaked the MILF, her exhaustion forgotten as her companion abruptly gathered her into his arms and lifted her off the couch. "What are you doing, Naruto?" But he ignored her question, and a huge blush crept up to her features as her breasts ballooned out and sank against the brick wall that was his chest. It didn't help that even through his shirt she could feel the sheer muscles he was packing. Naruto? She's always been a demure individual, as even as a little girl she would shy away from boys. Nothing changed as she grew older, not even when she met Timothy Ketchum. They were both 17 years old at the time, and she was working at Professor Oak's lab as an assistant when he stumbled into her life. With no prior romantic interactions with guys, she was overcome by hormones and emotions as he introduced himself to her. He was a regular of the mill Pokemon trainer, but she was caught off guard by the paean in his voice as he elucidated to her how it was his dream to become the greatest trainer of all time. That's why he made the strenuous trek through Kanto, so he could see the legendary professor. Fast forwarding a year, he made her the happiest girl in Pallet Town by confessing his love for her. The truth was that she fell for him ages ago, but she feared that he would leave her one day to pursue his dreams. Sadly for her, that's exactly what he did, that too on the day she announced that she was pregnant. She had every reason to hate the father of her unborn child, but she couldn't bring herself to do so. They were both young, and he got scared, so she forgave him for abandoning her in her time of need. Dating someone new while she was expecting did not sit well with her. Besides, she was still hurting from the heartbreak. Even before her baby boy was born, she was obsessed with him and she was actively doting on him once he was with her at long last. Years flew by as she showered him with her love, wanting to make sure he never makes the mistake his father did. She had cried her eyes out when he left for his journey, but he was a young man now and she knew he would make her proud. Amelia, Oak's daughter, had been begging for her to find a man now that Ash was gone, but she was only just getting used to his absence from home. And now this younger man was boldly carrying her upstairs. "Which room is yours?" She was not a confrontational person by nature, but she wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. However, this was too soon for her, and so swallowed a lump in her throat, unable to meet his gaze. "To your right." He said nothing in response as he strolled down the hall and gently kicked open the parted door in question. A brilliant hue was enveloping the bedroom as the moonlight was easily piercing through the mother's curtainless window. Approaching the edge of the bed, he lowered her onto the sheets. This was the defining moment of his mission. Her inexperience with romance was obvious, and it was clear that she would not be able to fight him off should he take things to the next level. Instead, he pulled the cover over her voluptuous frame, watching as she clenched the blanket, trembling and nervously staring at him from the corner of her eye. He wanted to move forward, but was frozen in place. What was he doing? What was the purpose of this? The inner struggle lasted nearly 10 seconds, but ultimately he surrendered to the side of him that his mates had claimed as theirs. There was no way he could do that to them. Not again. He spun on his heel and was about to leave when his enhanced sense of hearing picked up on her frail voice. "Stay." He was once again rooted in place, but this time because of the metaphorical shards of GL falling to the ground inside his mind. Naruto, his whisker marks stretched as his face contorted from the voice reverberating through his mind. Unbeknownst to him, 9 orange tails were swishing around violently as one of the Biju sealed within him tried breaking free from its prison. Who was that? And why did it sound so familiar? There was a pit in his stomach, but he wasn't presented with additional time to ponder on it. That's because the center of his universe became the picturesque MILF who was laying on her side, waiting for him. Delia Ketchum smiled softly as the bed creaked under the weight of her houseguest as he laid beside her. It wasn't that she was stupid, she knew full well how dangerous this was. She didn't know anything concrete about him other than his name. Where was he from? Was he involved with someone? Would she see him again? There were a myriad of questions, but right now she had this, and she was hoping that everything would fall into place very soon. Her nostrils flared as he rested her cheek on his muscular chest, inhaling his masculine scent. Taking advantage of her would have been so simple, yet the thought didn't even cross his mind. He was a stranger, but with just one interaction with him, she trusted him enough to invite him into her bed. Cerulean blue orbs softened as she snuggled with him. He coiled his arm around her and began running his hands along her back and hair, never once touching her inappropriately. The voice which had graced him with its presence earlier was out of commission, allowing him to enjoy this time with her as she moaned in response to his touch. Not a word was said between them, and he most certainly didn't trust himself to break the silence. Thankfully, she soon drifted off to sleep in his arms while he laid there, conflicted as ever. XXX, I love you. Naruto sighed as he sought catharsis in the arms of his pink-haired girlfriend, her admission only adding to his plight because of how heavy those 3 words were. He couldn't recall the last time where he hadn't ed a woman the night prior, yet his rambunctious cock remained entrapped within his pants until 4 a.m. So when he couldn't endure it anymore, he booked it out of the Ketchum household, but not before leaving a succinct note stating that he had something to take care of. It was a cowardly thing to do, but there was no way he'd be able to spend another second with her. When he arrived back at the headquarters, he found his girlfriends sitting up on the bed, patiently waiting for his arrival. It was then they revealed to him that they'd been receiving a mental playback from Mewtwo this entire time, so they were fully aware of what went down with the Pallet Town native. Rather than unload on him for accepting that mission and betraying their trust again, they sandwiched him in a tender embrace. Officer Jenny nodded into her boyfriend's back, her arms snaked around his waist. Ditto. I couldn't do it, whispered the distraught shinobi. I just couldn't do that to her. Neither Ava nor Stephanie responded since they were busy sorting through their lover's interaction with Delia Ketchum. Had they not seen it go down in real time, they would have never believed it. They were the ones who had set the groundwork, but Ash's mother somehow managed to break through to the blonde as well. Had it been any other woman, they knew she would have gotten screwed like a whore long before dinner would have been served. It mattered not to Ms. Jenny that the brown-haired mother was as amiable as she was gorgeous because she did not appreciate seeing her get all flustered and chummy with her man. Ms. Joy, however, was more open-minded about it because she was a fan of Delia's hospitality and overall character. When she caught her boyfriend with Ariana and then later with Jessie, it broke her heart not just because he had cheated on her, but also because she knew he felt nothing for these women. She didn't feel that emptiness when watching Naruto with Delia, though. But that's because there was genuine attraction between the two. This was a fact not even Ava could controvert. We'll have a talk about this tomorrow, but right now I wish to show just how proud I am of you, said Nurse Joy as she cupped the sides of her lover's face. With a chaste kiss, she uncoiled herself from him and proceeded to undo the knot tying her robe together. Big, juicy breasts jiggled as she kicked the downed garment aside, now fully naked as she had nothing on underneath. Crawling onto the bed, she dug her knees deep into the sheets and then bowed her head while prying open her bubble butt. Stephanie, whispered the Jinchuriki, always enthralled with the treasures hidden in the canyon between his girlfriend's derriere. Her dainty hands camouflaged nicely with the globes of her, and her puffy labia, which was peeking out shyly, looked mighty tasty. However, he was immediately drawn to the dark pinkish starfish that was her butthole as it became the center of his universe, drawing all attention towards it, the lines around it converging into a tight knot. He was in a trance as he approached her from behind. It was barely a day into them getting together that he orally tended to her darkest cavity. This was a completely foreign concept to her, and it embered her to no ends, but that didn't stop him from tonguing her butt. Not even 4 days in, he popped her anal cherry. Unlike with the other women he had fornicated with, he did his due diligence in prepping her for the sodomy. The experience was still extremely painful for her, and he wasn't surprised that getting butt-ed didn't end up being her favorite pastime. Moreover, doggy style was the one position she didn't like, yet she was offering herself to him in it right now because he did right by her. Not looking a gift horse in the mouth, he dug his face into her full, warm, round, her cheeks pressing against his head. Closing his eyes and letting his senses take over, took long, deep whiffs of her rear valley while pulling the edges of her anus open with his thumbs, gaping it slightly. As if it were her mouth, he formed a tight seal around her hole with his lips and began making out with it, slobbering on it, poking and tickling it with his tongue. Oh, Arceus, mewled Nurse Joy, her matronly thighs shaking as waves of pleasure crashed along the shores of her anus, the sensations easily traveling up her tunnel and through her liver. Easy, Naruto. Ms. Jenny was breathing heavily as she joined the couple on the bed, having had enough of sitting on the sidelines. She was also fully naked as she had discarded her robe. No, don't cut her any slack. Interrogate her hole and make it talk. Naruto did just that as he was arduous in worshipping the nurse's hole, lathering it with boiling hot saliva, moistening and softening her butt ring in preparation for the stretching it would soon receive by his monster cock. He then put his analingual ministrations on hold, only to travel lower along her silky perineum to lap up some of her secreting juices. She threw her hands off her wobbling derriere as he made contact with her pussy, followed by a choked gasp emerging from her throat as his tongue sneaked its way into her fleshy flower, looking for sweet nectar. Although the purpose of this was to lube up her hole, he couldn't help but gulp down the majority of her juices, she was so delicious. Returning to the scene of the crime, he separated her bottom with his hands since she was no longer doing so. He then began transferring a combination of his saliva and her vaginal fluids directly into the now gaping, dark pinkish hole. Once she was well lubricated, he removed his thumbs from her tremulous entrance and once again formed a seal around her hole with his lips. He smooched her dirty entrance, but this time wasting no time as he let his tongue slither out of his mouth and into her anus. Ava's butthole was a magical place, but Stephanie had the tightest hole he's ever come across. Naruto! Cried the pink-haired beauty, reaching back with her right hand and grabbing the back of her lover's head. She then began bucking her hips, smashing her into his face, allowing him to prod deeper into her dark chambers. I'm gonna. Officer Jenny whimpered, unable to endure the horniness any longer. Juices were bubbling out of her cooch, and at this rate she'd be orgasming without even touching herself. Crawling over to the nightstand, she took out the metal nightstick that got bestowed upon her on the day she was sworn into service with the Kanto police. She then returned to her screaming harem sister and her butt-munching boyfriend. Since the blonde wasn't using his hands to bifurcate the woman's tush, and was only using them to knead the luscious cheeks, she figured he'd be okay with releasing his right hand. She silently reached for and yanked his right hand from Steph's bottom and then placed her nightstick on his open palm, which he instinctively closed to grip the weapon in his hand. His face was still deep in the woman's, but his ears were conspicuous, so she leaned in close, making sure he heard her through his analingual frenzy. I want that nightstick in my... Obviously, she could have done it by her lonesome as she used to pleasure herself all the time. However, that was before she got together with her boyfriend. She wasn't sure how he was able to do it, but he was so adroit at that he was able to send her over the edge with just the simplest of touches. Resting her head about a meter away from her sister's own, she grinned over at the flushed nurse as she joined her in the submissive position. She pulled her bottom asunder with her hands, but didn't have to wait more than 15 seconds for it to come a knocking. Yes. Mewled Ava as her butthole dilated, stretching open to accept the invading girth of her nightstick until the cylindrical head disappeared inside her anus. Did it compare to her boyfriend's cock? No, that one-eyed beast was thrice as thick and was far lengthier, but the metal shaft still felt amazing as her sphincter muscles clamped around it. The Jinchuriki groaned, back seeking refuge in the nurse's hole, his tongue performing all kinds of twists and turns inside her, while his left hand was caressing her left buttock with meticulous care. His right hand, however, was wrapped around the handle of the nightstick as he was cramming it in the police officers. When he withdrew it from her, leaving only the tip trapped inside, her butt ring dragged out along with it, clinging to it as if trying to coax it back inside. He did just that, but when the base of the handle made contact with her puckered entrance, he began ramming the metal shaft in and out of her, butting her with her own weapon. Unsurprisingly, Stephanie was the first to orgasm, but she came harder than her green-haired friend. A copious amount of juices torrented from the depths of her feminine pageway and began splashing on the bed since her vagina wasn't the hole that was being tended to. She thrashed around on the sheets, bucking her hips wildly as she rode the high of her orgasm. At the same time, Ava Jenny expelled ephemeral, animal bursts of air before shrieking at the top of her lungs, her hole squeezing her nightstick as she inundated the sheets with her squirting vagina. Cerulean orbs fully tinted in a fog of lust, Kurama's host withdrew his tongue from his pink-haired girlfriend's hole whilst yanking the nightstick out of his second mate. By now his inordinate cock was so adamantine that it hurt, but he planned on pacifying it with some nurse butt. Naruto. The blonde stopped dead in his tracks, his hands frozen on the hem of his trousers. Mewtwo? The ladies also straightened up, having heard the telepathic voice as well. Prepare yourself, continued Mew's clone. Master Giovanni has just sent a team after Delia Ketchum. He plans to have her raped because you weren't able to complete your mission. The lust completely vanished from the blonde's face as the muscles in his jaw tightened. But how does he even know that the mission didn't go as planned? Perish the thought, because it is not I who told him, replied Mewtwo, having sensed the accusatory tone in the man's voice. I do not know how he found out, but what I do know is that she's the target. I'd also like to note that multiple teams are now headed your way and will be there shortly. Master Giovanni personally plans to execute your mates in front of you. What? Sputtered Stephanie as the color drained from her face. How can he do that to us? Ms. Jenny clenched her fists, her eyes flashing dangerously. It's because he knows we've gotten through to Naruto. It's true when they say the universe is coded by divine hand, and that the only real thing is love, invisible and weightless as it is. It's also true that love is the ultimate answer to healing hearts and societies, and that love is the driving force behind moral compass. Naruto could personally attest to all of the above because love was the emotion that broke through to him when nothing else could. It was but a mere crack, barely the length of a hairpin, but every exposure to this emotion erected dominoes in his head. His girlfriends were responsible for standing by his side during his darkest time and exhuming this emotion to the forefront of his mind. And threatening them was akin to taking a finger and flicking those metaphorical dominoes. A block fell, followed by another, until he had finally broken free from his mental restraints. His graduation day, the training trip he took with his sensei, the Fourth Shinobi War, all leading up to the battle with Kagaya Otsutsuki, it was all coming back to him now. The war was over and they had won, but the chakra progenitor refused to admit defeat, and that's when she made her final move. Had it been another time, he would have rejoiced to be whole again. However, an inconceivable amount of guilt began strumming through him as he recalled every last sin he had committed since crash landing into this world. Chakra exploded around him, creating a shockwave that rippled through the Kanto region. The entire headquarters started to shake under his power as hundreds of Team Rocket operatives collapsed under the pressure. Only his mates were unaffected since they were engulfed in a shroud of his chakra. Mewtwo, said the Jinchuriki, having finally regained his composure. I appreciate you telling me this, but I want you to go protect Delia. I will turn this world upside down if even a strand of her hair is out of place. Am I understood? The Pokémon hadn't quite recovered from the aftershocks of that explosion of energy, so it was shuddering as it spoke. Sea Crystal. Girls, I promise this will all be over soon, continued the blonde, now addressing his lovers as he created a sealless shadow clone. His heart was riddled with guilt from what he'd done to all those women, but what he did to his lovers was eating him up inside. He snatched a pair of good doers, neither of whom had committed peccadillos, away from their loved ones, and hurled them into a place infested with criminals. Even when he betrayed them, they still found it in their magnanimous hearts to stand by him because they could see in him what no one else could. And now he was going to spend the rest of his days expiating himself. That was his onus as their boyfriend. The police officer's eyes widened, realizing that her mate planned on exterminating Team Rocket. Wait, Naruto. UCA, she couldn't finish her sentence, nor could her harem sister begin hers as the blonde's doppelganger gathered them in his arms and vanished via Shunshin. XXX, please. Please. Kill me already, whimpered Executive Petrol, his heart hammering inside his chest like it belonged to a rabbit running for its skin. He was one of the most superficial Team Rocket members because he spent more time than female operatives did on fixing up his face. That well-kept face was now bloody and blistering, eyelids swollen nearly shut, hair falling from the front of his forehead in thin clusters. Naruto spat down on the piece of trash, gripping a rod in his hand which he had conjured with 6 paths chakra. Gladly. The villain's head snapped up as the metal smashed into his chest and his cries twisted into raspy moans by the time they left his cracking lips. He tried to say his final words, but all that came out was a guttural bark as his eyes rolled to the back of his head. "TCH," commented Shukaku from within the blonde's mind. "You should have tortured him like you did the previous guy. I loved it when you bashed his head so hard that his brains popped out." "Baka Tanuki," added Isobu, rolling its eyes at its fellow Biju. "I think Naruto's inflicted enough torture." Kurama sneered as it glanced around the headquarter hall through its host's eyes. "I think not. These bastards had us barricaded from Naruto for all this time and kept him from accessing his emotions and memories. Had it not been for his lovers, we would have lost him forever. I really want to talk to them," chirruped Matabi, the most excitable of all the Biju. "Can you let us out soon, Naruto?" "Yeah, sure," replied the ex-criminal. "Just give me a second to finish up here." Now he was staring at a bloody Giovanni, who was barely a foot away from an equally battered Persian. He was actually the first person he took out, but he didn't end the man's life. No. After beating the living shit out of him, he used magnet release to bind him to the wall, allowing the man to have a front row seat to what was to come. That's when he cut off his boss's left hand and eye, both of which came in handy for withdrawing some funds. He technically only needed a thumb from the hand, but it wasn't like he cared for such trivial matters. Sending a shadow clone downstairs, his replica made haste and used both ingredients to unlock the main vault. There were billions of Pokemon dollars in blueprints for future projects, though the latter meant nothing to him. That's when he called the entire force of Team Rocket towards him through the intercom. Hundreds of them came flooding in, and he macreed every single last one of them. Those who were on missions elsewhere were now being pursued by his other shadow clones. "Why you dare defy me?" hissed the criminal boss through gritted, imperfect teeth as blood dripped down his chin. It was bad enough that his left eye was gone, but he could barely see out of his only functioning eye socket since the blonde had punched him square in the face, effectively paralyzing his entire left side. "I saved you. You would have been dead had it not been for me." "No," replied Naruto, crouching down to the insignificant pest's level, only for the man's Pokemon to lunge at him with a renewed vigor. He simply gathered chakra into his hand and swatted it across the face, sending it soaring through the hall and then crashing into the wall behind them. It cried pitifully as it slid down the caved-in wall, now laying in a pool of its own blood. Not once had he looked away from Giovanni, who now had tears in his eyes from having watched his beloved Pokemon die in front of him. "You did not save me. I was ostracized as a child and grew up lonely. However, I endured every hardship because I had friends who supported me. I had a sensei who died for me. I had precious people to protect. But you took away what made me who I was by turning me into a monster, and now this monster is going to kill you." He then used his free hand to grip his soon-to-be-dead victim by the hair, just enough so he was standing straight. He then conjured a brand new chakra rod, courtesy of his 6 paths powers. Staring deep into the man's eyes, he proceeded to stab him above his heart before carving a perfect circle around said organ. Pulling out, he allowed the skin to roll off before reaching inside and grasping the faintly beating heart and tearing it out, effectively killing the criminal in the process. "Good riddance," said the whiskered ninja as he tossed the bleeding heart on his former boss's dead corpse. But we're not done yet. Shunshinying out of the headquarters, he landed safely on the ground directly proportional to the entrance of the tall structure. He scanned his surroundings, searching for the perfect location. Leaves swirled around him as he stood atop the hill overseeing the building. He then began channeling not only his chakra, but also that of all 9 Biju. A multitude of colors pooled together in the palm of his hand as chakra started morphing while a blood-curdling screeching sound was heard for miles. Dust began hovering like a twister in a desert area, and the combination was so overwhelming that wild Pidgeys and Spearows started fleeing for their lives, and so did every neighboring wild Pokemon. The potent energy force summoned liquid, golden ore streaks from the sky as they began molding and forging into forks above his head. Writhing and wriggling with the pain of its existence, the lightning flashed once, glossy and polished. He waited until he was sure no innocent creatures would get caught in the aftermath of his jutsu before jumping up in the air and propelling his arm forward.
Tailed beast Recentrican. In a matter of seconds, there was a blinding flash, like sheet lightning, and a huge ball of varicolored fire belched upward, leaving a series of smoke rings to float more slowly after it.
The horrendous shrieking of his Rasen shuriken then made contact, and there was nothing friendly about the megatons of violence that accompanied it. The engorged smoke rings rose, twisting, writhing, transforming into dark smoke in 1 second, belching flames the next, cackling with lightning the next. Following the explosion was wind so severe that surrounding thickets got ripped out of their very roots. Some trees were hundreds of years old and were among the unfortunate casualties as the entire landscape was being reduced to ashes. Cinder blocks whipped through the air, one nearly colliding with his face. The cliff had long since collapsed, but he was unfazed by all of the destruction because he was levitating nearly half a mile up in the sky, shrouded in six-path chakra. Nothing for miles was safe, which wasn't exactly a horrible thing because this place was safely tucked behind the veil of a Pokemon sanctuary. Mewtwo, commented Naruto, having just sensed the Pokemon appear beside him. Is Delia safe? Yes. I stopped her ailments long before they even reached her home, replied the psychic with trepidation. The blonde's technique was a ubiquitous one in the sense the vibrations were carrying all across Kanto, making its decision to teleport here an impetuous one. Thank you, said Kurama's host, expelling his breath in a wheeze. You're now free to do whatever you wish. Its eyes widened, flabbergasted to the degree it couldn't form a response. Did you think you were next on my hit list? Queried the Jinchuriki, earning a reluctant nod from the Pokemon. You're to blame for what happened to me, but in the end, you were a tool just as I was. Besides, you betrayed Giovanni because you knew it was the right thing to do. Had it not been for you, I wouldn't have known about his scheme. I would have most certainly been able to protect my girlfriends, but I would not have been able to do the same for Delia. Mewtwo was taken back by the blonde's compion. The reason why it felt so drawn to him was because they were essentially the same in its opinion. It was created to kill while he was reshaped into a killer. But seeing its power over him slipping bit by bit after he got involved with the females confirmed to it that it could change as well. By the time it overheard Giovanni's plans for Delia, it realized it had to take action. Wait, commented Mewtwo, seeing that the blonde was about to take off. I wish to join you. Naruto stared at it for a moment before shaking his head. I'm not a trainer, Mewtwo. I don't ever intend to become one. I implore you to reconsider, said the man-made creature as it got down on a knee, though they were both still levitating well above the ground. Please. A sigh escaped his lips, unable to find an acceptable reason to reject the offer. It would not be easy for his companion to settle down because it wasn't comfortable around humans. Even in the headquarters, it would stay cooped up in its own cabin unless it got called by Giovanni for a mission. Okay, fine. You can join me, but don't expect me to use you in a battle or anything. That's fine, replied Mewtwo, genuinely elated with the acceptance. Would you like me to take you to Delia? No, answered Naruto. I've done far too much wrong since coming to this world, and she deserves far better than me. Besides, I have to make up for the hardships I've put Ava and Stephanie through. The Pokemon silently nodded, though it wasn't actually homologating because it had seen how the blonde was with Delia. I see. Well, in that case, I sense that your mates are in Vermilion City. Shall I teleport us to their location? Sure, thanks, whispered Naruto, though his eyes were now locked on the crater that used to be Team Rocket headquarters. He was covered from head to toe with the blood of his enemies. Perhaps he should have washed it off when gracing his girlfriends with his presence, but he didn't care, he needed to see them. A flash of purple later, he found himself inside one of Team Rocket's lairs inside Vermilion City. This was instinctively where his shadow clone had taken his girlfriends to. Just like all of the other lairs in Kanto, this one was also free of rockets as his shadow clones hadn't dawdled in their task of exterminating every last one of those pests. Naruto. Thank Arceus you're safe, Naruto. His heart was racing as they came barreling towards him. They were no longer naked as his shadow clone had fetched their robes prior to shunshinying them out of the headquarters. A sigh escaped his lips, his refulgent smile putting the sun to shame as they threw their arms around him, crushing him with a desperate embrace. I love you both so much. Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny had tears pooling in their eyes as this was the first time their boyfriend had avowed his love for them. This was the man who they had spotted behind the veil of that emotionless shinobi. This side of him was who they fell in love with. This side of him was who they had abandoned everything for. They had shed blood, sweat and tears, but now the war was finally over, and he had emerged victorious. Perhaps it wouldn't be sunshine and rainbows from here on out, but it was clear as day that this was just the beginning of their lives together. XXX The Battle City tournament was in full swing, and Delia Ketchum was currently in Saffron, having checked into a modest hotel suite a couple of hours ago. Mimey didn't like going outside of Pallet Town, so he decided to stick back and stay on top of the housework. He also had plenty to do over at Professor Oak's lab, which had become a pigsty because he was collaborating with other professors over the recent discovery of mega evolution. Although this hotel wasn't the cheapest one available, spending the funds was well worth it. Other than the beautiful decor, she had a 2-bedroom suite, which would allow her son and his friends to stay with her for the duration of the tournament. The boys would thus be able to bunk in one room, while Misty, her son's female traveling companion, would bunk with her. This was meant to be a surprise, so she hadn't informed him that she was here yet. She planned on doing that tomorrow as he was set to compete at 3 p.m. for his quarterfinals match. The next 10 minutes or so were spent with her doing dishes while ironing out details for the feast. She had already purchased the necessary groceries and had brought along a box of her cookware from Pallet Town. Unlike most hotels, this one provided their guests with adequate-sized kitchens to make them feel at home, which was their motto. Just then, the sound of knocking echoed through her hotel suite. She quickly dried her hands with a paper towel, tossed it in the bin, and began making her way to the door. She turned on the handle, and within seconds her heart began hammering fervently in her chest. Flanked by Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny was the man who's been on her mind for quite some time now. "Hi, Stephanie," Ava greeted the mother kindly before turning her attention to the blonde. "Hi, Naruto." The woman replied in kind, but the shinobi was flabbergasted as he hadn't expected to see the Pallet Town native ever again. "Hi, Delia." There was a look of amusement shared by the three ladies, but it was Ava who was the first to respond. "Steph and I have been talking to Delia for 2 weeks now." The blonde sighed as he ran a hand through his hair. That much was obvious because how else could the MILF know his lover's first names? There was supposed to be no secrets between them, so why did they initiate these clandestine meetings? And when? He turned to see their sheepish smiles, and his brain began processing this strange turn of events. Nearly a month has gone by since he had wiped Team Rocket off the face of the earth. And while it was great news for Kanto and horrible news for other criminal organizations, it was overwhelming for him. His relationship with his two lovers changed, but in a positive way. Guilty about separating them from their loved ones, he decided that they'd settle down in Celadon City. The residents were in shock, but that went away as they commenced with hosting a Meve celebration. Nearly every available Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny dropped what they were doing and came rushing to the city to welcome their respective cousins back. And the cherry on top came in the form of Ava's and Stephanie's replacements relinquishing their positions and returning to their original posts in the Alola region. Mentally, he was doing a lot better, but he had to thank his lovers and the Biju for that. Killing was a part of being a shinobi, and innocent lives were hapless casualties of war. However, he was haunted by his previous actions because so many Kanto natives had perished at his hands and had done nothing to deserve it. Casual was not a foreign concept to him as he had banged more than his share of older women on his training trip with Jiraiya. However, what he did to dozens of women here was unforgivable as almost none of it was consensual. Ava and Stephanie were the only exceptions since they were the only ones whom Mewtwo hadn't minded ahead of time. But despite all of his wrongdoings, his two lovers still forgave him. And he loved them from the bottom of his heart. Then, a week ago, they were both awarded a couple days of leave, so he decided to take a trip with them out of Celadon. Vermilion had been their first stop while Saffron was their second and final one. He was obfuscated by their hotel choice since there were far more expensive ones available, but now it all made sense. He was brought out of his trance by a dainty hand intertwining with his. He stared down to see Delia Ketchum looking up at him. She hasn't left his mind from the day he had met her, and that precious memory began replaying in his head as he met her warm gaze. She was vivacious, and she was the only one other than his girlfriends who could make his heart race like this. "We can talk inside," whispered the MILF, gently squeezing the burly man's hand. "Shall we?" Although he had regained his composure, he settled on a silent nod as his answer. His girlfriends were nowhere in sight, but a cursory glance ahead confirmed that they were already inside the hotel suite. They must have strolled in while he was busy taking a trip down memory lane. Hand in hand, He allowed her to lead him to their destination, even though it was clear as day. He removed his hand as they stopped by the sofa. He took a moment before taking a seat. "Okay, so let's hear it. Stephanie called me 2 weeks ago from the Pokemon Center," began Delia while tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear. "At first I was confused when I saw her face pop up on my screen, but then she explained that she was your lover. I sat there in shock for Arceus knows how long before hanging up the phone." Nurse Joy nodded as she placed her hands on her lap. "I called her again, but she didn't answer. It took a handful of attempts for her to finally accept the call again, but this time she didn't cut the call short. I still think I should have been the one to call her first," piped in Officer Jenny, narrowing her eyes at her harem sister. "You said I'd be too blunt about it, yet you basically did the exact same thing." Big tits jiggled as Ash's mother giggled, the mellifluous sound filling their surroundings. But the amusement died down as her voice faded into a mere whisper. "It goes without saying that I was heartbroken. I told her everything," added Stephanie, her eyes locked on the blonde, whose features were schooled as he was giving nothing away. "And you can get mad at Ava and I for it, but it had to be done." Naruto exhaled deeply, those words hitting him harder than the vehement, quotidian pounding he subjected Officer Jenny to. Forget Delia learning that he was involved with not one, but 2 women. If she knew everything, then that means she's aware that he was sent to seduce her that day. Then that means she's also aware that he was a member of Team Rocket, the very organization that had been hunting down her son ever since he began his odyssey as a Pokemon trainer. It was almost painful doing so, but he had to glance over at the MILF to gauge her facial expression. Doing so only shocked him since she appeared to be calm, cool and collected. "And do you know why Stephanie and I told her?" chimed Ava, making sure her boyfriend was looking at her before she pressed onward. "It's because we know you're in love with her." Cerulean blue orbs widened and all that came out of his mouth was a silent gasp. He had told them everything about his past life and all he did since becoming Giovanni's puppet, but this was the one thing he hadn't vouchsafed to them. Love at first sight was a myth, or at least he thought so until he came across them. It was this very love that helped them bring him more and more out of his shell. What he felt towards Delia that day was just that, love at first sight. However, he couldn't bring himself to confess that to his girlfriends because he felt he had put them through enough as is. "You made me fall for you like it was nothing, and then you walked away from my life," spoke Delia as tears welled in her eyes. "I don't care what you did in the past, Naruto, because you aren't even to blame for those heinous acts. I've spent countless hours talking to Ava and Stephanie about this, and they only just recently gave me their blessings." She slowly roamed her eyes over to the left to find the 2 women, who had become dear friends to her, nodding at her, both sporting smiles that could put stadium lights to shame. She then rose from the sofa and stopped right in front of the whiskered shinobi. He slowly lifted his head, glancing at her with softened eyes. "If you have feelings for me, then show me. Kiss me. Prove to me that I'm not a fool for loving too easily. What are you waiting for? Fornicate with her already. Way to ruin the mood, Baka Tanuki." Naruto heard neither of the Biju, nor did he see anything else in the room as Delia Ketchum became the cynosure of his eyes. Ever since he met her he's been harboring feelings for her. He knew full well from their interaction that she had been just as affected by him as he was with her, but he didn't think that this would actually happen for him. Tearing his gaze away from her, he looked over at his girlfriends, both of whom were conveying to him through their pianate gaze that they were genuinely okay with this. Craning his neck back, he reached out and grabbed Ash's mother by her waist before reeling her in like a fisherman reeling in a majestic melodic. Everything fell into place in that moment as her big, juicy breasts ballooned out against his chest and his hand fell to the spheres of her delectable booty through her dress. Not once had she stopped peering into his eyes and not once had he stopped peering into hers. In that moment, all of the emotions that had been simmering under the surface rose like a tempest. "MMHPH," came Delia's muffled cry as the younger man crashed his lips against hers. She instinctively closed her eyes, melting into his embrace, finding his lips soft, which she thought was preternatural for such a burly man. The first kisses were tentative, their lips just barely brushing against each other. It was then his tongue darted out to lick her upper lip, then her lower, seducing her into opening her mouth in response. Her tongue slithered out, and their tongues touched lightly, just the tips, tentatively. As they continued to kiss, the oral organs became just part of it, sometimes with one dancing along the line of a lip, sometimes diving into a mouth in pursuit of its counterpart. Even after he parted from her lips, she could still feel the warmth of his lips and the tremors running through her legs. When she opened her eyes, she shooed away the light particles bombarding her field of vision to find that he was staring at her. Then, in the space of a heartbeat, he drew her in for yet another kiss, this time claiming her forever with it. Moans rumbled from the depths of her soul, traveling up her lungs, through her throat, her oral caverns, until the sounds were traveling directly into his mouth. Timothy was the only man she had ever been in a relationship with, but this young man was putting the father of her child to shame. She was a panting, flushing mess as he broke their kiss. Arceus. That was amazing. Wow, Naruto chuckled as he pecked the mother on her cheek, then to her ear. But he didn't offer her a verbal response, and instead responded by bringing his mouth to hers again. He kissed her harder this time, only amplifying the experience for both of them as he began kneading her bubble butt through her dress like he was rolling out dough. On and on he made out with her, and thanks to his enhanced ninja senses he could smell her vagina oozing creamy nectar, barely able to contain itself. At long last, he pulled away, and a thick strand of saliva connected his lips to hers. He reached for the hem of her dress, but then stopped before he could take things any further. Delia, are you sure you want Ava and Stephanie here for our first time? She was breathing raggedly, a pretty cerise hue streaking across her cheeks. She turned her head to find her now official harem sisters sitting on the sofa, clearly enraptured by that pie-innate make-out session. If she was being honest with herself, she hadn't even noticed those two because she was so caught up with kissing the blonde. But as weird as it sounded, it almost felt right to have them here. After all, had it not been for them allowing it, she would have never had the chance to pursue her feelings. Yes, replied Delia, her eyes still on the two women, watching as they both appeared shocked with her answer. She smiled as she turned back to the younger man. Please take me, Naruto. Not requiring any more than that, he hooked his thumbs under the hem of her dress and began hiking it up past her hips. His head resting over her shoulder, he was blessed with the vista of her big, round jutting out with a hypnotic bounce as he released it from the cotton fabric. Can you girls take her panties off? And Naruto, cried Delia, only to be silenced with a kiss. MMMPH. Nurse Joy was too embered to do so, but Officer Jenny wasn't. The greenette smoothly approached the couple and crouched behind her new harem sister. Without a word, she reached for the hem of the woman's panties and began peeling them down. Delia quickly pulled her mouth off the blonde, but her hysterical cries of embarrassment didn't stop the police officer, and she didn't let go of the undergarment until it was in her possession. Having completed her task, she tossed the panties on the floor, but didn't return to her spot with Stephanie. I appreciate you giving us this chance to stay, Delia, but your first time with Naruto should be private, said the greenette as she reached out and ran a hand through the woman's hair. I hope you find with him what Stephanie and I have found with him. I'll see you both later tonight. Delia was about to respond when her other harem sister came and gently patted her on the head. The nurse then came between her and her boyfriend and pecked the man on the lips. Have fun, you two. Bye, girls, whispered Delia, watching from the corner of her eye as the ladies disappeared out of the hotel suite. She turned her head back to find her lover staring at the retreating figures. They are so wonderful. They are, and I love them dearly, replied the Jinchuriki, his chest swelling with pride and warmth as he spoke. He wasn't omniscient, but what he did know was that he didn't deserve those angels in flesh. There was nothing he wouldn't do for them, and very soon he was planning on proposing to them. He had already placed the order for 2 opulent diamond rings, both with their names engraved on the stones. In just 3 days he would be able to collect the rings, and that's when he planned on popping the question. Digging a hand between the older woman's butt cheeks, he began sawing in and out of her, feeling the immense heat rolling off her hole and the peachy folds of her vagina. He had to restrain himself from stuffing his fingers up her anus there and then, as he couldn't exactly start off with butt worship. Grabbing the back of her head with one hand while gathering her legs in the other, he pushed her head down while yanking her legs up. Doing so resulted in her head dangling off the sofa and her legs resting on either sides of his shoulders. He would have chuckled in response to her squeals, but he was mesmerized by the neatly trimmed strip of dark pubic hair adorning her small, tight, gorgeous pussy atop of which sat an engorged clitoris. It was a perfect mommy pussy. Naruto, whispered Delia, a blush coloring her cheeks, having made the mistake of glancing up at his face. But despite her embarrassment, she was barely holding it together as her vagina was burning for his touch. Please. Love me. Normally, the game plan would have been to move down on her slowly, but never touching her cunt, and instead kissing the insides of her thighs, licking them, just barely grazing the area surrounding her pussy. He would have followed that up by spreading her outer labia and blowing a gust of air into her, but still not giving her a languid tongue lashing. That wasn't the game plan this time around as he buried his face between her thighs. If he hadn't been able to admire it before, he definitely could now. With him now in close propinquity of her snatch, his already excited nostrils were whiffing an amalgamation of sweat, perfume and feminine nectar. He began ing and kissing her outer labia, pulling the folds gently with his lips. Her hands instinctively fanned out around her, at times slapping the sofa cushions, and others hitting his calves. Deciding to make it easier on her, he manhandled her until she was sitting on the sofa, her legs spread. There was no lollygagging involved as he commenced with kissing and licking around her clit, feeling it swelling with even more blood. Running his tongue down to her entrance, he began focusing on the introitus of her cunt and darted out his tongue to the base of her vagina. She responded with a scream and by throwing her legs around him, snaking them around his neck. But he didn't even notice any of this as he began sliding his tongue up and down along her slick folds of her cooch. Yes. Oh, Arceus. Yes. Cried Ash's mother, her body shaking, her nerves coursing with electricity, her muscles twitching. Her mind was blinded with pure pleasure, and her cunt was drooling all over the younger man's mouth as he was overwhelming her with skill at cunnilingus. I can't. I don't think I can handle it for long. I'm gonna. It always inflated his ego to sense his lover's bodily reactions to his pursuits, feeling her body heat rise, her pelvis writhing beneath him, sometimes to the point that it became difficult staying latched on her pussy. However, no matter what she did, he continued servicing her, and a cascade of mini orgasms rippled out of her, expeditiously converging into a single, tempestuous climax. MMMINNNGGGG, shrieked Delia at the top of her lungs, bucking her hips wildly, smashing her pussy into the younger man's face. All at once, a tsunami of juices came gushing from her depths and the waves crashed over and overloaded her nervous system. For the next couple of minutes she continued bucking and moaning, not knowing what was happening to her. She started coming to, only for her face to screw up as a shockwave rippled through her womanhood, eliciting a wail from her. Her bountiful tits jiggled as she wiped her sweaty face, only to realize that her boyfriend was behind this mess. She realized there and then that he wasn't going to stop despite having triggered the biggest orgasm she's ever had in her life. She tried to force him to retreat by boxing him in with her clenched thighs, but it was to no avail. Naruto. Please. My pussy is sore. Unfortunately, hearing this garnered the complete opposition reaction from him as he began going mental on her pussy. If that wasn't enough, he moved a hand up to move back the diaphanous cowl protecting the glorious organ of love that was her clitoris. Pressing down on her clit with his palm, he began making circular motions with his hand, interrogating the hardened nub, all while dexterously swirling his tongue so deep inside her that he was crossing uncharted territories within her. With just his tongue, he was prodding her deeper than Timothy ever had with his paltry. Until now her hands were on either side of her, her nails digging deep into the top of the hotel sofa. But now her hands were buried deep into her lover's hair and began yanking on it while thrashing around on the sofa as legs started undergoing spasms. Tears started pooling in her eyes as goosebumps appeared all over her skin, the pleasure becoming too much for her. Like a dam collapsing, her moans metamorphosed into a caterwaul that emanated from her core as he dragged another orgasm out of her. I'm minning GG. Groaned Naruto, his jaw moving fluidly as he swallowed every last drop of his gushing girlfriend's juices. His eyes sparkled as he tried mouthing her palatable pussy even after it had coughed out the remaining drops. Having sated his voracious appetite, he opened his eyes to find that she was shivering like a leaf, struggling to stay awake. Reaching for the hem of her rolled-up dress, he began hiking it further up her body and didn't stop until he was pulling it off her shoulders. There wasn't even the slightest bit of protest from her since she was still going through post-orgasmic tremors. Tossing her dress aside, he ran his eyes over to her chest. The lacy white bra was struggling to contain her big tits and her shoulder straps were digging into her shoulders, the full weight of those large tits ready to make those straps explode. The best part was that although the fabric wasn't see-through, he was still being granted an exiguous glimpse of her pink, throbbing nipples. Leaning in, he reached around her and unclasped her bra, wasting no time as he slid it off her shoulders. Her meave, sweaty tits swayed and jiggled to a stop, and his eyes hungrily drank them in as they jutted out from her chest. They were so full and so round they formed a natural creve of smooth, white cleavage. And her nipples were immaculate. Round, smooth areolas, just the right size, twisted in lust, her hard nipples pointing outward, yearning for pleasure. "You're perfect, Delia." "Nah. Naruto," whispered Delia, having never sounded so small in her life. She was tuckered out, but clearly her ravenous boyfriend wasn't as he scooped her up in his muscular arms. Her big tits mashed against his chest and her luscious wobbled when he began carrying her over to the carpeted floor of the hotel lounge. It was then he began undressing himself, and what she saw gave her the fantods. At first he exploded upon her with the visual of his protruded-out pectorals, which looked like firm plates on his chest. Her eyes timorously ran over his oh-so-broad shoulders, which supported the definition of his meave biceps that spoke volumes of his immense upper body. Her breathing was labored, and a frisson of emotion swept over her as she drank in his rock-hard abs and that V-shaped torso tapering illy to his narrow waist. And then he dropped his trousers. It sprang out like a Sharpedo lunging at an unsuspecting whalmer, and easily became the commanding presence in the room. She hadn't seen many penises in her life. Well, she only saw the one in person, which was Timothy's, and the rest were in some magazines which she still regretted purchasing. However, this young man was sporting such a gigantic cock that it made her bring her hands over to her vagina, instinctively shielding it. Dark blue veins ran down the throbbing rod like it was a bolt of lightning firing down the night sky. The length was absurd, but it was also corpulent, so much so that it appeared to be thicker than her wrist. Giant balls hung below it that were undoubtedly holding gallons of jism. Arceus. Naruto. You can't fit it in me. It won't fit, maundered Ash's mother as the blonde settled between her legs, his monster cock hovering above her hand-cupped cunt. He didn't need to hear the MILF to know she was fearful of his size. It wouldn't have mattered to the previous version of himself, which was devoid of emotion, as that version of him would have simply split her open without caring about the consequences. The exceptions being his girlfriends, of course. He reached out, spreading his hands across her big, juicy tits, her nipples scraping his palms. "Do you trust me?" She met his gaze, and doing so made her stop shaking. Her heart raced as she nodded, a smile etching across her features. "I do." "Then let me love you like you want me to," replied Naruto, a profound intensity pooling in his eyes. "Let me claim you as mine forever." Removing her hands from her vagina, she dug her forearms into the carpet and used them as leverage to push herself up. Despite their nether regions not even remotely close to touching, his monster cock was bumping into her tummy. She was a moaning mess even just seconds into smashing her lips against his, feeling her nerves wash away as they swapped saliva without a care for the world. It took a minute, but she pulled away, panting softly. She was still fearful, but she knew this pain was ephemeral, and soon she would be experiencing pleasure the likes of no other. It was then a sharp sensation shot through her like that one time her son's Pikachu had launched that thunderbolt on everyone in Pallet Town. And it was simply from her boyfriend brushing the petals of her flower with his voluminous cockhead. Tears welled in her eyes as her outer lips began splitting obscenely, and even then it wasn't enough to accommodate him. She arched her back, but by instinctively angling her hips, she unknowingly exhorted her vagina to not only take in the tip, but also the first few inches of his shaft. The stretching was incredible, so much so that it reminded her of when she gave birth to her son. Obviously, that was beautiful and rewarding, but the actual act of releasing a human baby from her vagina was incredibly challenging. Nothing had compared to that pain, but now she was being challenged again, this time by the meave cockhead digging through her sacred tunnel. "Arceus. You're so big, Naruto. That's a good girl," extolled the Jinchuriki, bringing his hands up from the hysterical mother's waist and placing them on her shoulders, rooting her in place. This was necessary because she was shaking her head from side to side, thrashing about. Although the visual of her bouncing tits was more than pleasant to his eyes, it was imperative for him to be in complete control. He then drove deeper, easily managing to subjugate her vaginal muscles and cram even more into her. She screamed a silent scream, but her raucous voice could very well have ripped through her vocal cords. She just wasn't sure as he tore through her vagina, breaking her, enslaving her to his cock. Now she couldn't endure the prospect of him not being glued to her, and so she rocked her hips, her luscious booty bouncing off the carpet as she threw her arms around his neck, pulling him on top of her. She felt his deep, masculine chuckle vibrating against the side of her neck, and while she was embered, she dug her nails into his upper back, keeping him firmly inside her. Stars appeared in her field of vision as she began undulating her hips against his, somehow managing to adjust to his size. She was relaxing just an infinitesimal bit when he smashed his lips against hers and began withdrawing his gargantuan weapon, sliding it out through her pussy. When only the head of his cock was still held within her, he began reversing the procedure, shoving it back into her. She bellowed into their kiss, but didn't get to enjoy it for long as he withdrew a final time before smashing into her, and this time his giant testicles slapped against her as he crammed all 15 inches of his cock inside her. "Naarrrruuuto," shrieked Delia as she tore her lips off her boyfriend's, her verbal cry confirming that his cock had permanently reshaped her motherly pussy. He was already banging into her cervix before going balls deep inside her, but now it felt like he was well in her tummy. Creamy nectar gushed from her depths, splashing around his prodding length as her womb surrendered to his onslaught. Tears trickled down her squeezed-shut eyes when he began thrusting, causing juices to splash out of her with every pee. She mewled as he slammed his lips against hers again, and for the next 4 hours ruined her for every other man on the planet. She belonged to this young man now. XXX, Cha, Pikachu, cried Ash, watching on as his trusted Pokémon swayed from side to side before collapsing to the ground, swirls replacing the blackness of his eyes. "We lost again, buddy." He balled up his fists as he fought back tears. Losing was one thing, and he had lost his fair share of battles since beginning his journey. However, it was another thing to be outcalled in every way imaginable. If that wasn't enough, who he was battling wasn't even a Pokémon, it was a human. Suddenly, a shadow casted over him, blackening his field of vision. He was dilatory in lifting his head. "I can't win the Indigo Plateau Conference at this rate, Dad." Cerulean blue orbs softened, his whisker marks stretching as a smile curled to his lips. He was still a little overwhelmed at the fact he had a 10-year-old son now. 5 months have flown by since he mated with Delia Ketchum, and every second since then has been wonderful for him. He officially met Ash the morning after he ate his mother and was pleasantly surprised with how much of himself he saw in the kid. It wasn't too long after proposing to Stephanie and Ava that he proposed to his third girlfriend as well, but by then Delia had already moved out of Pallet Town and was living with them in Celadon City. Naruto had upgraded the previous lodging into a mansion of sorts on the outskirts of the city. While she did love her town, she knew she had to think more than just herself because Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny were both crucial to Celadon. Besides, it wasn't like she wouldn't see her friends again. She went back home once every month and she was able to communicate with her friends over the phone. Their wedding was held in Rhoda, which was the only place in Kanto that was willing to officiate a polygamous marriage. That's because in times of war, Aura Guardians and Kings were allowed to impregnate multiple partners to ensure that they have progeny to pee the torch onto. Naruto did not want to see Queen Eileen again, but he had to face the music sooner or later. The meeting obviously didn't go well since she was still infuriated with him for ditching her not even an hour after taking her virginity. But thanks to the intervention of his brides, she agreed to sign off on the marriage. It also helped that he returned everything he stole from her when he was last there. The wedding was the talk of Kanto and Johto alike since it was the first time in over a century that a man was getting married to more than one woman. Obviously, ladies from all over had choice words about this, and so did men, but both for different reasons. But these comments never even reached the quartet's radar as they couldn't care less for such balderdash. Besides, it wasn't like they had invited an audience. Everyone was essentially from the bride's side since the only guests he had were the Biju and Mewtwo. Delia, Stephanie and Ava had all hand-picked their wedding dresses, and he wasn't allowed to see them until the day finally came. His tuxedo wasn't extravagant, but it fitted him well enough that his immense physique was obvious through the garment. He definitely turned a few heads from the ladies in attendance, but every soul was rendered speechless when the brides came sauntering down the aisle, all rocking their separate dresses. None of them had opted to don white. Stephanie decided on a pink, fluffy dress that ended at her ankles. Ava had on a navy blue dress that ended at her knees. Delia chose a caramel dress which was a shade darker than the color of her hair. The one thing that their dresses had in common was that the garments were designed to accentuate their sinuous figures. Needless to say, every single man in attendance was envious of the blonde. Ash was busy training for the Indigo Plateau Conference while his stepfather, two stepmothers and mother were away on their honeymoon. Since he ended up getting knocked out in the semifinals of the Battle City tournament, he wanted to give it his all in this major competition. Perhaps some of his rivals were right, and that it was quixotic of him to expect to win his first ever conference. Be that as it may, reaching for the stars was the only way he would ever become a Pokemon master. Seeing how determined the 10-year-old was, Naruto decided to help him achieve his goal of taking home the crown. And so he called the boy over to join him on the island where he was honeymooning with his wives on. The island was sequestered from civilization and was humongous in size, making it a perfect location to train the kid and his Pokemon. What he was truly after was molding Ash into a veteran trainer by sharpening his mind and training him in hand-to-hand combat. He wasn't interested in training the Pokemon, but that didn't mean he didn't have a plan for them. Releasing the 9 Biju from his body proved to be a time-consuming task, but he set them free long before he got married. Right now the Chakra Beasts were a safe distance away, working with Ash's Pokemon. The heavy hitters were singled out. For instance, Charizard was an impressive battler, but was bereft of finesse and strength, and so Matabi and Son Goku were both pushing him to beyond his limits. Mewtwo was also present, and it was there to keep a force field active, stymieing the shockwaves from escaping the training ground. It was also there to provide aid to those Pokemon which were capable of learning psychic moves. "Pull yourself together, son," said Naruto as he patted his stepson on the head. "I told you this would not be easy, and I promised you that you'd take the world by storm when this was all over. Now let's take a break." The young trainer nodded slowly, seeking comfort in the older man's words. All his life he's wanted a father who could guide him down the right path. He had his mother, sure, and he loved her from the bottom of his heart, but he just couldn't share his insecurities with her. That was because she's been playing the role of both his parents since the day he was conceived. Adding to her worries simply did not sit well with him. Naruto was kind to him and wasn't afraid to shower him with affection. It felt like a natural reflex for him to regard him as an older brother. It also felt natural to refer to him as a parental figure when he heard that his mother was getting married to the blonde. The one thing that drove him crazy about this was that he all of a sudden had 2 stepmothers since his father was married to Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny as well. Brock obviously regarded the shinobi as a deity for this, but then again his friend was a hopeless pervert. "Okay, Dad," replied Ash, now grinning up at the blonde. "I'm going to see how the others are doing." The Jinchuriki chuckled and nodded, and within a couple of seconds was watching as the boy scooped up Pikachu before making a beeline for the training ground on the other side of the island. He turned around and began sauntering over to the home, a rustic wood lodge his shadow clones had constructed ahead of time, he was sharing with his wives. In a matter of seconds, he was a couple dozen steps away from the trio and found that they were admiring him from afar, clearly from observing his interaction with Ash. Delia in particular was beaming like a gloom in the midst of evolving into a blossom. All 3 were sporting bulging tummies as they were between 2 and 3 months pregnant. This wasn't obvious, however, since they were donning robes that were showing off an immense amount of cleavage. He didn't waste any time after proposing to start making babies with them. Marrying them long before their due dates came around only made sense since they wanted to fit into their dresses. He was closing in on them when they rose from the porch. Whatever he was planning to say died down his throat as they turned around in unison and hiked up their robes from the back. Nurse Joy was now exposing herself in a thong that wrapped around her waist, meeting in a tiny triangle, before traveling down into the crev between her delectable, disappearing there. Similarly, her harem sisters were all donning the tiniest thongs that could frame their sensational S, showcasing their immaculate, gorgeous bubble butts. Delia grinned as she looked over her shoulder, watching her husband leering at her derriere with burgeoning hunger. "You're so sweet with my baby, so now his mommy is going to be sweet with you, honey." "Ah, the mushy stuff," chimed Officer Jenny as she wiggled her hips, shaking her big, fat booty. "I've been a bad girl, and I deserve to get punished." Stephanie bit down on her bottom lip, but didn't say a word, not that she needed to. With her glancing at her husband from her shoulder, her sanguine face informed him that she was ready for some pionate again. He continued making his way towards them, though now he was doing it with a spring in his step. They all squealed and scampered off through the door and into the lodge they were sojourning in, their flawless reactions confirming they had orchestrated this whole thing. He let out a hearty guffaw as he chased after his wives. One wasn't going to suffice. He's gotta catch 'em all. Thanks for watching.